I remember that night like a photograph that keeps fading at the edges. Not because the memory is old, but because it feels like it was never meant to be captured in the first place. It was one of those late hours where the world feels like it has been emptied of everything but the road ahead. I was driving alone, my headlights cutting a narrow path through the darkness, and I kept thinking about how strange it is that we all pretend we're in control when we're really just following lines painted on asphalt. The highway had been quiet for hours. No other cars, no distant headlights, no radio stations that made sense. The kind of silence that makes you want to turn up the volume just to remind yourself you're still alive. I had been on the road for longer than I wanted to admit. My phone had lost service somewhere past the last town, and I had been trying to keep my mind occupied with small things. How the road curves, how the trees sway, how the sky seems darker when you're alone. Then I saw it. A small sign, half hidden behind a row of pines. The kind of sign you only notice if you're already looking for something wrong. No words, no arrows, just a rectangle of metal that had once been white, now rusted and dull. The arrow on the sign pointed left, into a thin road that I hadn't seen before. The road looked more like a trail than a real road. The asphalt was cracked, and grass was growing through it like the ground was trying to swallow it back. I slowed down, and the car's tires made a soft hiss as they rolled over the worn edge. I remember thinking, this can't be right. This isn't on any map. But I also remember the way my body relaxed when I turned. It was like my mind had been waiting for something to happen. A small break from the monotony. A reason to keep going. I turned onto the road, and the trees closed in around me. Not in a dramatic way like a horror movie. More like the world had simply decided to stop widening. The road grew narrower. The pines leaned closer, their branches forming a kind of roof overhead. The air felt cooler, even though the night wasn't cold. It was just denser. The headlights made long, thin shadows that moved with the car. The shadows stretched across the road and then disappeared into the dark. Every time I passed a tree, I felt like I was passing a person. Like the forest was full of quiet bodies standing still, watching. I tried to shake off the feeling. I told myself I was tired. That's all, just tired. It's easy to blame fear on fatigue. It gives your mind a safe place to hide. But even as I told myself that, I noticed something else. The road wasn't just narrow, it was wrong. There were no signs of maintenance, no painted lines, no reflectors, no streetlights, not even the usual gravel or debris that you'd expect on an old road. It was as if this path had been made and then abandoned in a hurry. The asphalt looked like it had been poured and then left to harden without any care. I drove for a while, and the silence kept growing. It wasn't just quiet. It was like the world had been muted. The car's engine sounded too loud. My own breathing sounded too loud. I realized I hadn't heard an animal, not even a bird, not even the small rustle of something in the underbrush. It was as if the forest had stopped living. I reached a point where the road split, not in a clear, organized way, just a place where the asphalt seemed to end and then begin again in two directions. There were no signs, no markings, just the road splitting like a cracked mirror. I slowed the car again, and my hands tightened on the steering wheel. I looked left, then right. I couldn't decide which way to go. The left road seemed to go deeper into the woods, and the right road seemed to curve towards something I couldn't see. I felt a strange pull toward the left, like the road was calling me. I didn't know why I chose it, I still don't, but I turned left. The trees seemed to lean closer after that. The branches brushed the roof of the car like fingers. I felt the car shake slightly, and I thought for a moment that I had hit something. But when I looked in the rearview mirror, there was nothing, just darkness. The road kept going, and I started to feel the strange sensation of being watched. Not by a person, not by an animal, but by the forest itself, like it was listening, like it knew I was there. I tried to focus on the simple things. The sound of the engine, the feel of the steering wheel, the faint scent of pine. But the deeper I drove, the harder it became to hold onto normal thoughts. My mind kept drifting to the idea that the road wasn't supposed to be here, that I had somehow entered a place that wasn't meant for people. I checked my fuel gauge. It was still in the safe zone. That didn't help. If anything, it made me feel worse, because it meant I was still moving, still going forward, still choosing to continue. The trees began to change. The pines thinned out and the trunks grew older and wider. The bark was rough and cracked, and the branches hung low like tired arms. The forest felt older here, like it had been here long before anyone else, like it had secrets that it had been waiting to keep. Then I saw the first sign of something human. A mailbox. It was sitting on a wooden post, leaning slightly to one side. The paint was faded and the metal was rusted. The flag was up like someone had recently used it. There was no house nearby, no driveway, no path, just the mailbox standing alone in the dark. I stopped the car and stared at it. My heart started to beat faster, not from fear exactly, but from confusion. Why would there be a mailbox here? Who would receive mail in a place like this? The road was barely wide enough for a car. There was no sign of a home. I got out of the car. The air was colder now. The silence was so complete that my footsteps sounded loud, like they were being echoed by the trees. I walked closer to the mailbox. The wood felt damp when I touched it. The metal was cold. I opened it. Inside was a stack of envelopes. They were old, yellowed, and sealed. Some were torn, as if someone had tried to open them and then changed their mind. There was no name on any of them, no address. Just blank envelopes like they had been made for nothing. I closed the mailbox and stepped back, feeling foolish. I wanted to laugh, but the sound felt wrong in that place. I got back into the car and locked the doors. My hands were shaking, and I couldn't tell if it was from fear or from the cold. I turned the key in the ignition. Nothing. The engine didn't start. I tried again, still nothing. I watched the dashboard lights flicker, then go dark. The car was silent, like it had been waiting for this moment. I sat there for a long time, listening to my own breathing. Then from somewhere deep in the woods, I heard a sound. Not a voice, not a scream, just a soft, slow rustle, like someone moving through leaves, like someone walking in a place where no one should be walking. My heart hammered in my chest. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, a deer, a fox, anything. But the sound didn't move like an animal, it moved like a person. I stared into the darkness, waiting for something to appear. Nothing came. The sound stopped. The silence returned. And in that silence, I realized something that made my skin crawl. The road didn't feel like a road anymore. It felt like a path that had been waiting for me, like it had been designed to bring me here. I tried the ignition again. Nothing. I looked at the mailbox one more time through the windshield, and I noticed something I hadn't seen before. There was a small piece of paper taped to the side of the mailbox. It was folded, like a note someone had left for themselves. I couldn't read it from where I sat, but I knew in that moment that I was not supposed to be there, and that the road had already decided where I was going to go next. The note on the mailbox was small, folded twice, and taped on with a strip of clear plastic that had yellowed with age. I couldn't read it from the car, but I could feel its presence like a weight pressing against the metal. I stared at it for a long time, my hands still gripping the steering wheel, waiting for my mind to make sense of the situation. I didn't know what I expected to happen, that the car would start, that the forest would suddenly open and reveal a town, that someone would appear and explain everything like a calm person in a movie. None of that happened. The engine stayed silent. The forest stayed still. And the note stayed there, as if it had been waiting for me to notice. I finally stepped out of the car. The cold air hit my face like a hand. I walked to the mailbox, and the ground beneath my feet felt soft, almost sponge-like, like the earth was still holding onto moisture. My shoes made a quiet sound with each step, the only sound in the world. I reached the note and pulled it free. It was heavier than it should have been. The paper felt thick, like it had been made from old materials. I unfolded it slowly, careful not to tear it. The writing inside was neat, like someone had taken their time. If you're reading this, you're already too far in. That was it. No name, no date, no explanation, just that single line. I felt a strange wave of relief and dread at the same time. Relief, because I wasn't imagining it. Dread, because it meant someone had been here before me. Someone who had left a warning. Someone who had known the road would bring me to this point. I looked around, half expecting to see a person watching from the trees. But there was nothing, just the dark and the road stretching forward like a black ribbon. I got back into the car, and for a moment I considered turning around, going back the way I came, trying to find the highway again, trying to escape whatever this place was. But the road behind me looked different now, not because it had changed, but because my mind had changed. It was no longer just a road. It was a path I had chosen, a path I had already committed to. So I started the car again. Nothing. I tried the ignition a few more times, my fingers moving faster now, my heart beating harder. The dashboard lights flickered once, then went dark. The silence returned. I sat there, breathing slowly, trying to calm myself. I told myself I could walk. I told myself I could find help. I told myself I was not the first person to get lost in the woods. Then I heard a sound. A soft, distant sound. It was the faintest click, like a latch being moved, like a door opening somewhere far away. My body froze. I listened. The sound came again. Closer. It was followed by another noise, a slow scrape, like something being dragged across wood. The sound made the hair on my arms rise. I looked ahead down the road. I couldn't see anything yet, but I could feel it, like a presence in the air, like the forest had shifted. I opened the car door. The cold air rushed in and the smell hit me immediately. Old smoke, wet wood, the scent of a fire that had burned long ago and then gone out, leaving only the memory of heat behind. It was the kind of smell that makes you think of a cabin, of a small room with a fireplace, of a place where someone once sat quietly and watched the flames. My feet moved without me thinking about it. I walked toward the direction of the sound. The road was barely visible now, covered in fallen leaves and pine needles. The trees leaned in so close that I had to duck to avoid brushing my head against the branches. The forest seemed to grow darker as I moved forward, but not because the night was deepening. It was as if the trees were blocking the light, like they were closing in on me. Then I saw it. A cabin. Not a ruin, not a broken-down structure, but a cabin that looked like it belonged in a postcard. A small wooden building with a steep roof, a chimney, and a porch. The windows were dark, but they were clean. The wood was not rot. The door was closed but not locked. It looked maintained. I stopped for a moment, my breath catching in my throat. It didn't make sense. This place was supposed to be abandoned. This road wasn't on any map, yet the cabin looked like someone had been here recently. The smell of smoke grew stronger as I approached. The wet wood smell was almost overpowering, like the cabin had been built from fresh logs. I could see faint trails of water on the porch, like someone had walked through the rain. I stepped onto the porch. The wood felt solid under my feet. It wasn't creaking like old boards usually do. It was steady. The air was still, and I could hear the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears. I reached for the door handle. It was warm. Not hot, but warm, like someone had touched it recently. Like the cabin had been waiting for someone to come. I pulled the door open. The inside was dim, lit only by the faint glow of moonlight through the windows. The air was thick with that smoky, wet smell. The room was small, with a simple table, 2 chairs, and a fireplace. The floor was clean. Not swept clean, but clean in a way that made you feel like the place was still being used. There were no signs of dust, no cobwebs, no decay. But there was something else. The cabin felt empty in a way that didn't make sense, like a house that had been cleared out too quickly, like someone had left in a hurry. I walked further inside, my shoes making quiet steps on the wooden floor. The fireplace was cold, but the ashes looked fresh, like the fire had been put out not long ago. There was a stack of logs beside it, neatly arranged. The kind of neat arrangement you only see when someone cares. I looked around the room, trying to find any sign of a person. A coat, a cup, a book, anything that would tell me someone had been here. Then I saw it. A cup on the table. It was a simple mug, ceramic, with a small crack on the side. There was a dark stain inside it, like old coffee. It looked like it had been left there for days, maybe weeks. But the smell was still strong, like someone had used it just hours ago. My stomach tightened. I moved closer to the table and reached out to touch the mug. The ceramic was cold. The stain inside looked dry, but it was still there, like a shadow. I pulled the mug closer and looked inside. There was a thin layer of ash at the bottom, not from the fire, but from something else. Something that had been burned in the cup, something small. I set the mug down slowly, my hands shaking. I stepped back and my eyes moved around the room again. Everything was in place. Everything looked normal. But the air felt wrong, like the cabin was holding its breath. I heard the sound again, the latch click, the scrape of wood. This time it was closer. It sounded like it was coming from the back of the cabin. I turned toward the back wall. There was a door. I hadn't noticed it before. It was plain, the same color as the wall, like it was meant to blend in. The kind of door you only see when you're already looking for it. My mind told me to leave. My body told me to move. I reached for the door handle. It was warm. I stood there for a long time, my hand still on the door handle. The warmth in my palm was steady, like a heartbeat. I remember thinking, if this door is warm, then someone is here. Or someone was here very recently. I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself the cabin was just old, and old houses sometimes hold on to heat. But the truth is, I could feel the heat in a way that didn't belong to the house. I opened the door. The room beyond was small and dim. It looked like a storage area at first, with a shelf of old tools and a stack of wood. But then I saw the bed. A simple bed with a thin blanket folded neatly at the foot. The mattress looked clean, almost too clean, like it had been replaced recently. A small lamp sat on a nightstand, and beside it was a drawer that was slightly open. My mouth went dry. I stepped inside slowly, as if moving too fast would wake something. The floorboards creaked under my weight, but the sound didn't echo. It felt like the cabin was absorbing it. The air in the room was cooler than the main area. It smelled like damp fabric and old wood. I walked to the nightstand and looked down at the drawer. It was the kind of drawer you could open without thinking. The kind of drawer that hides nothing. But this one felt like it was hiding everything. I pulled it open. Inside was a journal. It wasn't a fancy one. No leather cover, no ornate binding. Just a simple notebook with a worn cover and a frayed spine. The pages looked thick, like the kind you use for sketching. The cover was dark, almost black, and there was no title. My heart started beating faster. I didn't want to read it. I didn't want to know what was inside. But my hand moved anyway, like it had a mind of its own. I took the journal out and held it close. The first page had writing on it, neat and careful. If you find this, I don't know how to tell you what I've seen without sounding crazy. I stared at the words for a long time. The handwriting was steady, like the person had been writing calmly at first. But the letters seemed to grow more uneven as I moved through the page, like the writer was losing control. I turned the page. The cabin is not empty. The words were written larger, almost like the writer had pressed harder on the pen. I felt a chill run down my spine. I looked around the room again, as if expecting to see someone watching. I turned another page. It started with small noises. At first I thought it was the house settling. Old wood, wind, animals, but the sounds were too regular, too deliberate. I read on. I hear footsteps at night, not in the hallway, not outside, inside the walls, like someone walking behind the wood, like someone moving slowly, searching. The writing was getting messier. The lines were uneven, and the ink had smudged in a few places, as if the writer had wiped their hand across it. I could almost feel the panic in the page, like the words were trembling. I turned the page again. I tried to ignore it. I tried to tell myself it was my mind, but the sounds became clearer. I can hear breathing. Not mine, not from outside, from inside the walls. I felt my own breathing tight. I looked at the wall beside me, at the wooden boards, the seams between them. I imagined something behind them, something living, something patient. I turned another page. I put my ear against the wall. I could hear it. A slow, steady breathing, like someone sleeping, like someone waiting. I tapped the wall. I called out, "Nothing," but the breathing continued. The handwriting had become shaky now. The letters leaned in different directions, like the writer's hand couldn't stay still. I started leaving food, just small things, a piece of bread, a cup of water. I would place it near the wall and leave the room. I thought maybe it was a person trapped, someone hiding. I thought I could help. I stopped reading for a moment. I stared at the wall again, thinking about the idea of leaving food for something behind the wood. The thought felt wrong, like feeding a wild animal through a fence. I turned the page. The food disappears. Every time, I know because I check, I watch, I come back and it's gone, not eaten. Gone like it was never there. I swallowed hard. The journal felt heavier in my hands, like the words were weighing it down. I continued reading. I thought maybe someone was sneaking in, but the door is locked. The windows are sealed. The cabin is in the middle of nowhere. No one comes here. No one knows about this place. I'm the only one. The writing became more frantic. I heard a voice once. Not words, just a sound. Like someone trying to speak but not able to, like a mouth moving without a mouth. It was coming from the wall. My skin prickled. I looked around the room again, half expecting to see the wall breathing, half hoping it wasn't real. I turned the page. I tried to leave. I packed my bag. I drove out, but the road wouldn't let me. It kept leading me back. I thought I was going crazy. I thought the forest was playing tricks. The words on this page were almost scribbles. The lines ran into each other. I think the cabin is alive. I think it wants me here. I think it is feeding on my fear. I read the next line and felt my stomach drop. I heard it today, the voice. It was clearer. It said my name. I paused. I stared at the page, unable to move. I could feel the air in the room shifting, as if the cabin itself was listening. I felt the walls press in, just a little, like the space was shrinking. I turned the page again, my hands shaking. I tried to write this down so someone would know, so someone would find the cabin and know what happened. But I don't know if anyone will ever come, if anyone will ever read this. The next line was the worst. If you are reading this, please leave. Please don't listen to the sounds. Please don't open the door behind the wall. My eyes moved to the back wall, the door I had opened, the one that felt warm, the one that seemed to have been waiting. I felt the cabin's air grow colder. I kept reading. I think it's in the walls. I think it's been here longer than I have. I think it has learned how to hide. I think it knows my thoughts. I think it knows when I'm alone. The last page had no more writing after that. Just a few lines that looked like they had been drawn by someone pressing too hard. A rough circle. A line through it. A small dark scribble. Like a mark someone makes when they're trying to remember a shape. I closed the journal and held it to my chest. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. I looked around the room again and everything looked the same. The bed, the table, the fireplace, the neat stack of logs. But the cabin didn't feel the same. It felt like a place that had been waiting for someone to read the words inside. I stepped back from the drawer and looked toward the door that led back to the main room. The air felt thick, like it was full of dust. I could feel my skin prickling, and I realized I had been holding my breath. I didn't want to go back into the main room, not because I was afraid of what was there, but because I was afraid of what I might bring with me. The journal felt like a key, like opening it had unlocked something. I walked toward the door and reached for the handle. It was warm. Again. My hand trembled as I turned it. The main room was still there. The table, the mug, the fireplace, everything in its place. The same stillness, the same smell of smoke and wet wood. But now I could hear something else. A faint sound. A slow, steady breathing. Not mine. Not outside. Inside the walls. I stood there listening and realized the cabin was not empty. It never had been. And I didn't know if I had just read about the owner's fear, or if I had just become the next person the cabin wanted to keep. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't really try. The cabin was too quiet for sleep. Not quiet in a peaceful way, but quiet in a way that felt like the world was holding its breath. The kind of quiet you notice when you're alone and the darkness seems too thick to be real. I sat on the edge of the bed, the journal still in my hands. The words inside it felt like they were burning through the paper, like the pages had absorbed fear and were now holding it, waiting to share it with anyone who read them. I kept telling myself I was just tired, that I was overreacting, that the journal was the only reason my mind was racing. But the cabin was not a normal place. The air felt heavy and the smell of wet wood stayed in my nose like a constant reminder. Every time I tried to think of something else, my mind returned to the wall, the back wall, the one with the door, the one that felt warm. I tried to tell myself that the owner of the journal had been sick, that maybe he had been paranoid, that maybe he had been alone for too long, that maybe he had heard things that weren't there. But then I heard it. A whisper. It was faint, like someone speaking from the other side of a closed door. It was so soft I almost didn't hear it. I thought it might be the wind. I thought it might be the trees. But the sound didn't come from outside. It came from inside the walls. I froze. My heart started beating fast, but I didn't move. I didn't want to make any sound that might draw attention. I stared at the back wall, trying to find the source. The whispering continued, soft and slow, like someone speaking into a pillow. I couldn't make out any words. It was more like a rhythm, a low, murmuring sound that rose and fell. The kind of sound you hear when someone is trying to remember something, when they are talking to themselves in a voice that only they can hear. I stood up slowly, my feet feeling heavy. I moved closer to the wall. The wood felt colder than the rest of the cabin, and I could feel a faint vibration, like something breathing behind it. The whispering stopped for a moment. Then it started again. Closer. It sounded like it was right behind the wall now, like someone was leaning against it, pressing their face to the wood. My mind raced. I thought of the journal, the words about footsteps and breathing, the warnings, the note on the mailbox. Everything was connecting, like pieces of a puzzle that was forming into something I didn't want to see. I backed away slowly, my eyes never leaving the wall. I felt like the wall was watching me, like it knew I was there, like it was waiting. I walked to the front room and stood near the fireplace. The cold ashes looked like they had been disturbed, like someone had moved them recently. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind, but the cabin was still. The air didn't move. The whispering started again. This time it sounded different, like a voice trying to imitate a human voice, like it was practicing. It was so quiet that it almost felt like it was inside my head. I sat down on the chair at the table, my hands shaking. I kept looking around, expecting to see something, someone, anything. But the cabin was empty, too empty, the kind of empty that feels like a trap. I tried to focus on my breathing. I counted slowly. 1, 2, 3. I tried to calm my mind, but the whispering continued like a memory trying to return. I looked at the journal again. I wanted to throw it into the fire. I wanted to destroy it and forget everything, but I couldn't. It felt like the journal had become a part of me, like the cabin had attached itself to my thoughts. The whispering grew louder, but still not loud enough to understand. It was like a song without words, a sound that didn't belong to anything living. I stood up and walked to the door. I tried the handle, it was locked. My heart dropped. I hadn't locked it, I was sure of it. I had left it open. I had come in and I had never touched the lock, yet now it was locked from the inside. I pulled the door hard, but it didn't budge. The wood felt solid, the lock held tight. Panic started to rise in me, but I forced it down. I told myself there must be a reason. Maybe the door had a latch that I didn't notice. Maybe the cabin was old and the wood had shifted. I looked around for another exit. The windows were there, but they were sealed shut. The glass was thick and fogged like it had been there for a long time. The frames looked strong. No way to break them without making noise. I sat back down at the table, feeling the weight of the journal in my hands. The whispering continued, and I realized something that made my blood run cold. The whispers were not random. They were responding to me. Every time I moved, the whispering changed. Every time I spoke, even in my own head, the whispering seemed to shift as if it was listening. I tried to speak out loud just to test it. I said, "Hello." The whispering paused. Then it returned softer, like someone trying to imitate my voice. I said, "Who are you?" The whispering paused again. Then it started, and I could swear I heard a word. Not clearly, not fully. But the sound was there. "You." It was barely a sound, but it was enough to make my skin crawl. I stood up and walked to the back wall again. The door was still there, the wood still warm, the air still heavy. I pressed my ear against the wall. The whispering was right there, close enough that I could feel the vibrations, close enough that I could feel the shape of the words. But I still couldn't understand them. It felt like my mind was not allowed to hear the full message, like the cabin was holding back the meaning. I pulled away, breathing hard. I felt dizzy. I sat down again, trying to slow my breathing. The whispering continued, like a soft wave that never ended. I thought about the journal owner, about his warnings, about the food he left for something behind the walls, about the way he said the cabin was alive. I wondered how long he had stayed. I wondered how long he had listened. I wondered if he had ever left. I looked at the clock on my phone, even though it had no signal. The screen was dim, but the time was still visible. It was past midnight. The night was deep. The woods outside were dark. I realized I had no idea how long I had been in the cabin. I had no idea how long the road had been behind me. I had no idea if anyone would ever find me. The whispering continued. I stood up and walked to the fireplace. I picked up a log, feeling its weight in my hands. I held it for a moment, thinking about the journal, the walls, the whispers. Then I set the log down. I couldn't bring myself to light a fire. The smell of smoke was already too strong. The cabin didn't need fire to feel warm. I sat back down and listened. The whispering grew louder, but still soft enough to be a secret. It sounded like it was coming from every direction at once, like the walls were speaking in unison. I closed my eyes and tried to imagine myself outside the cabin. I tried to imagine the road, the mailbox, the note, the darkness, anything that would make me feel grounded. But the whispering followed. It was as if the sound had attached itself to my thoughts, and no matter where I went, it would be there. I opened my eyes and looked around the room one last time. The cabin was still. The air was still. The whispering continued, like a memory I couldn't forget. I knew then that I had to leave. Not tomorrow. Not in the morning. Now. I stood up, grabbed the journal, and rushed to the door. I pulled on the handle again. The door opened. It wasn't locked anymore. I don't know how long it had been locked. I don't know why it had opened. But I didn't stop to think. I ran out of the cabin and into the night. The forest greeted me with its silence. The road was still there, faint and narrow. The trees leaned in, watching. The air was cold and sharp. I ran, not knowing where I was going, just moving forward. Behind me, I heard the whispering. Not loud, not clear, just a soft, quiet sound, like someone speaking behind a door. Like a memory, like a voice that had been waiting for me to leave so it could follow. I didn't plan to go to the lake that weekend. I had been working too much and my mind felt like it was full of noise. So when my friend suggested a quiet trip away from the city, I agreed without thinking. I wanted silence. I wanted something simple, a place where I could sit and watch water and let my thoughts drift. The lake was farther than I expected. The road narrowed the closer we got, and the trees began to close in like they were trying to keep us out. The air smelled different there. Not like the city, not like the forest, but like something older. Like the kind of air you breathe when you're near water that has been sitting for a long time. We arrived just before dusk. The lake looked calm, like a dark mirror. The sky was a soft gray, and the water reflected it perfectly. The only sound was the gentle lap of the waves against the shore. We set up our tents near the water and made a small fire. My friend was already talking about fishing, about the best spots, about the kind of fish the lake had. I listened, but my mind was elsewhere. I kept looking at the water as if it might show me something. As the night grew darker, we noticed an old man sitting alone on a log near the shore. He had a fishing rod, but he wasn't fishing. He was just sitting, staring at the water. He wore a thick coat even though the air wasn't cold. His face was weathered and his eyes looked tired. I didn't think much of him at first. Old men sit by lakes. It's normal. But there was something about the way he sat, like he was waiting for something. My friend waved at him. The old man didn't wave back. He didn't even look at us. He just kept staring. After a while, my friend got up and walked toward him. I stayed behind, pretending to be busy with the fire. I could hear their voices, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. Then my friend returned and sat down beside me, looking pale. "What did he say?" I asked. My friend shook his head. "He warned me." "Warned you about what?" My friend hesitated. "About a cabin." I laughed softly. "A cabin here." My friend didn't laugh. "Not just any cabin. He said there's a cabin on the shore. He said it doesn't belong to this world." I felt a chill run through me. I looked toward the lake, but I couldn't see anything. The darkness had swallowed the shore beyond our camp. "Are you messing with me?" I asked. My friend shook his head again. He was serious. He said if we go looking for it, we'll never come back the same. I stared at the water. The waves moved slowly, like they were tired. I thought about how easy it is to ignore warnings. How easy it is to pretend something strange isn't real because it would make life harder to understand. I asked, "What did he look like?" My friend described the old man. His coat, his tired eyes, the way he stared, the way he didn't seem to blink, the way his fishing rod was tied to the log, not in the water, like he didn't care about catching anything. I kept thinking about the phrase, "doesn't belong to this world." It sounded like something from a story, like a line from a movie, but the way my friend said it made it feel real, like the old man had lived long enough to know things most people don't. We tried to ignore it. We drank some water, ate a little, and tried to sleep. The lake was quiet and the fire was low. The night felt heavy, like it was pressing down on us. I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the cabin. I kept imagining it hidden somewhere in the dark, waiting. I kept thinking about the old man's warning. At some point, I heard the sound of someone walking near the water, not close to our camp, but somewhere down the shore. I sat up and listened. The sound was slow and careful, like someone trying not to be heard. I thought it might be my friend. Maybe he had gone to check on the old man. Maybe he was curious. Maybe he was just restless. I got up and walked toward the shore. The sand was cool under my feet. The water was dark and still. I could barely see the outline of the trees on the other side. I called out softly, "Hey, who's there?" No answer. The sound of footsteps continued, moving slowly along the shore. I followed it, keeping a distance, trying not to show myself. The night was quiet enough that I could hear every small sound, every leaf, every branch. I walked for a while, and then I saw a faint light. It was far away, near the edge of the trees. Not a campfire, not a lantern, just a small glow, like something burning slowly. It looked like a light inside a window, but there was no house in sight. I stopped. My heart started beating faster. I felt the old man's warning in my mind. The cabin doesn't belong to this world. I thought about turning back. I thought about going to my friend and telling him to come with me. But I couldn't. The light drew me in, not like a magnet, but like a curiosity you can't ignore. I walked toward it. The further I went, the quieter the lake became. The sound of the water seemed to fade. It was like the lake was holding its breath, waiting. The light grew brighter as I got closer. I could see now that it was coming from a window. A small cabin, hidden among the trees. The wood was dark and old, but the light inside made it look almost warm. I stopped at the edge of the trees and looked at it. The cabin was small, with a porch and a single window. There was no smoke from a chimney, no sound, just the light. I felt a strange feeling, like I was standing on the edge of something I couldn't fully understand, like the cabin was a door to somewhere else. I wanted to leave. I wanted to go back to my friend and forget the whole thing, but I couldn't move. My body felt heavy, like I was being held in place by the air itself. I stood there for a long time, watching the cabin. The light flickered slightly, like a candle. The trees around it swayed gently, even though there was no wind. I tried to tell myself it was just a cabin, a lonely cabin, someone's private place, but the feeling in my chest wouldn't let me. I finally turned and walked back toward the camp. The night seemed darker now, and the lake sounded louder again. I could hear the water, and I could hear the distant sound of my own breathing. When I reached the camp, my friend was awake. He was sitting by the fire, staring into the flames. His face looked tense, like he had been thinking too hard. I didn't tell him what I had seen. I didn't tell him about the cabin. I didn't tell him about the light. I just sat down and pretended like everything was normal. But inside, I knew the old man was right. There was a cabin on the shore, and it didn't belong to this world. I couldn't sleep that night, not because I was scared exactly, but because my mind kept replaying the old man's warning like a sentence I couldn't forget. It doesn't belong to this world. I kept thinking about the cabin and how it seemed to glow in the dark like a small flame. I told myself I was being ridiculous. I told myself it was just a lonely cabin with a light. But the more I tried to push the thought away, the stronger it became. It felt like the cabin had put itself inside my head, and now it wouldn't leave. When the night finally became quiet enough, I stood up and walked toward the shore again. My friend was asleep, his breathing slow and steady. I didn't wake him. I didn't want to drag him into whatever I was feeling. The air was colder now, and the lake looked darker. The water was still, but it felt heavier, like it was holding something inside. I walked along the shore, my feet sinking slightly into the damp sand. The sound of the water was soft, almost gentle, but it wasn't the same sound as before. It was different, like the lake had changed its voice. I walked until I reached the edge of the trees, where the cabin had been. I expected to see the light again. I expected to see the cabin waiting for me. But the cabin wasn't there. I stood still, my heart beating hard. I looked around, trying to find it. The trees were dark and thick, and the shore stretched out like a long, empty line. The lake was calm. The night was quiet. I started to feel stupid, like I had imagined the whole thing, like my mind had played a trick on me because I was tired and lonely. Then I saw the light. It wasn't far away. It was closer than I remembered. The light was low, like a lamp inside a small window. It flickered gently like a candle. I walked toward it, faster now. My legs moved before my mind could catch up. I felt like I was being pulled. The cabin was there again. It was closer to the water than I thought possible. It sat right on the edge of the shore, as if it had been placed there by someone who didn't care about tides or weather. The wood was dark, almost black, and the windows reflected the water like black mirrors. The reflection was so perfect that I could barely tell where the cabin ended and the lake began. I stopped at the edge of the water and looked at the reflection. The lake looked different near the cabin. The surface wasn't as calm. It moved in small, slow ripples, like something was moving underneath. Not waves, not wind, something else. I stared at the water for a long time, trying to understand it. The ripples seemed to move in patterns, like someone was drawing circles beneath the surface. The water looked alive in a way that didn't feel natural. The cabin's windows reflected the ripples. They looked like black mirrors with moving shadows inside. It was as if the cabin was watching the lake, and the lake was watching back. I felt a strange feeling in my chest. Not fear exactly, more like a deep, quiet unease, like I had stepped into a place where the rules were different. I walked toward the cabin's porch. The wood creaked softly under my weight, but it didn't sound like a normal creak. It sounded like a sigh, like the cabin was breathing. The door was closed. There was no lock, no handle, just a smooth wooden surface. I reached out and touched it. The wood was cold, but not from the air. It felt like it had been cold for a long time. I pressed my hand against the door and felt a slight vibration, like something on the other side was moving. I pulled my hand away quickly, my heart pounding. The light inside the cabin flickered. I stood there for a moment, trying to decide what to do. My mind was full of questions, but my body felt stuck. It was like the cabin had made me slow, like it didn't want me to rush. Then the door opened. Not with a sound, not with a creak. It just opened like it had been waiting for me to touch it. The inside of the cabin was dark, but I could see the faint outline of furniture. A table, a chair, a small fireplace. Everything looked simple, like a cabin built for one person. I stepped inside. The air was thick and damp. The smell of old wood and water was stronger here, like the cabin had soaked it up. The floor was clean and the walls looked solid. The windows were dark, reflecting the lake like black mirrors. I walked toward the window facing the water. The reflection was so clear that I could see my own face in it. But the face in the glass didn't look like me. It looked tired, older, like someone who had been staring into darkness for a long time. I stepped back, feeling a cold wave run through me. I told myself it was just my imagination. I told myself the reflection was a trick of the light, but the feeling didn't go away. I looked around the cabin again. There was no sign of anyone, no belongings, no personal items, just the furniture, just the emptiness. I walked toward the fireplace. There was a small pile of ash inside. The ash looked fresh, like the fire had been out recently. The smell of smoke was strong, even though the fire was cold. I looked at the walls. The wood was old, but it was smooth and polished, like someone had cared for it, like someone had been here keeping it clean. I heard a sound. A faint, soft sound. It was coming from the wall behind the fireplace. A small tapping, like someone knocking from the other side. I stood still and listened. The tapping stopped. Then it started again. Closer. I felt my skin prickle. I turned around slowly, trying to see where the sound was coming from. The wall was plain with no door, no opening, just wood. I pressed my ear against it. I could hear something. Not a voice, not words, just a slow, steady movement, like someone shifting their weight, like someone breathing. My heart started beating faster. I stepped back, my hands shaking. I felt the cabin's air closing in around me. I looked at the windows again. The black mirrors, the reflection of the lake, the ripples that moved without wind. I realized something that made my stomach turn. The water near the cabin was moving in the same pattern as the tapping. It was like the lake and the cabin were connected, like they were sharing the same rhythm. I backed away from the window and walked toward the door. I didn't want to stay here. I didn't want to be inside a place that was linked to something in the water. But the door was closed now. Not locked, just closed. And when I reached for it, it didn't open. I tried again. The wood didn't move. The door didn't budge. It was as if the cabin had decided I wasn't allowed to leave. The sound from the wall grew louder. The tapping became a slow, rhythmic beat, like someone trying to get my attention, like someone trying to call me. I stood there, trapped in the cabin, listening to the sound that was coming from the wall and the lake at the same time. The air felt heavy, and my breath came out in small, quick bursts. I didn't know what the cabin was. I didn't know why it was here. I didn't know why the lake moved differently near it. All I knew was that the cabin didn't belong to this world. And now I was inside it. I didn't know how long I had been inside the cabin before the panic began to settle in. At first, I thought it was just fear, a normal reaction to being trapped in a strange place. But as the minutes passed, the fear started to change. It became something deeper, something older. It became a feeling like I was being watched by something that didn't need to see me to know I was there. I stood in the cabin for a long time, listening to the tapping sound coming from the wall. The rhythm was slow and steady, like a heartbeat. It made me think of the lake outside and how the water had moved in the same pattern, like the cabin and the lake were connected. I tried the door again. It didn't open. I pulled harder, but the wood didn't budge. It was like the cabin had become solid, like it had decided to keep me inside. I started to walk around the room looking for another way out. There were no windows that opened. There were no hidden doors. Nothing. Just the small space, the table, the chair, the fireplace, and the wall that was making the sound. I sat down on the chair and tried to think. I tried to remember how I had found the cabin. I tried to remember the old man's warning. I tried to remember anything that might help me understand what was happening. Then I remembered the lake. The way it had moved differently near the cabin. The way the water had ripples that seemed to follow the tapping sound. The way the cabin's windows reflected the water like black mirrors. I realized I didn't know anything about this lake. I didn't know its name. I didn't know its history. I didn't know if anyone else had ever been here. I needed answers. I needed something to hold on to. I looked around the cabin again, searching for any sign of a person, any clue, any hint of what this place was. On the table, I noticed a small stack of papers. They were old, yellowed, and folded. I picked them up and unfolded them. They looked like pages torn from a notebook. The writing was faded but still readable. It was a list. Not a grocery list, not a list of supplies, a list of names. Each name had a date beside it. The dates were spread over many years. Some were recent, some were old. Some were so old the ink had faded almost completely. I stared at the list, feeling a cold wave wash over me. The names looked like a record, like a log, like someone had been keeping track of people. I read the first name. A date, a small note. Boat disappeared. I read the next name. Boat disappeared. I read the next. Boat disappeared. My stomach tightened. I flipped through the pages. Every name had the same note. Every date had the same note. The lake had swallowed the boats. I looked up at the wall again, listening to the tapping. I could feel the connection between the cabin and the lake more strongly now. The cabin wasn't just near the water. It was part of it. I sat down and tried to understand. I tried to think of a logical explanation. Maybe someone was using the cabin to hide stolen boats. Maybe someone was pulling boats under the water. Maybe there was a hidden current. Maybe there was a sinkhole. But the more I thought, the more the cabin felt like something else. Not a building, not a place, something more like a trap, something that waited. I stood up and walked to the window again. The black mirror reflected the lake, and the ripples were still there. The water moved slowly, like something was breathing beneath it. I watched the surface for a long time, trying to see anything, trying to see a boat, trying to see a person, trying to see anything that would make sense. Then I saw something. A dark shape under the water. It was far from the shore, but close enough to be visible in the moonlight. It looked like a boat, or what was left of one. The shape moved slowly, as if it was being carried by a current. I stared at it, my breath catching. I felt the cabin's air press against my lungs. I thought of the names on the list. I thought of the dates. I thought of the people who had been lost. I imagined the boats being pulled under, one by one. I imagined the people inside, screaming, fighting, trying to get out. I imagined the lake swallowing them like it was eating. The tapping sound from the wall grew louder. It was almost like someone knocking, like someone trying to get out. I pressed my hand against the wall. The wood was cold. The tapping continued, and I felt the vibrations through my palm. It felt like a heartbeat. It felt like something living. I pulled my hand away quickly, like the wall had burned me. I sat down again, my mind racing. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know if I should try to escape or if I should try to understand. I didn't know if the cabin was trying to keep me here or if it was trying to help me. I looked at the list of names again. I noticed something I hadn't seen before. At the bottom of the page, there was a note in a different handwriting. The letters were larger and the ink was darker. It looked like someone had written it recently. They hear you, they always hear you. I felt my skin prickling. I looked around the room, suddenly feeling like I was not alone. The air felt thick, like the cabin was full of invisible people. I stood up and walked to the fireplace. I looked at the ash again. There was something in it, something small. I picked it up carefully with my fingers. It was a small piece of wood, charred and black, but it looked like it had been carved, like someone had made a mark in it. I held it up to the light. The mark looked like a symbol, a circle with a line through it, the same symbol that had been in the journal I found in the other cabin. My throat tightened. I couldn't stop the thought from forming. This isn't the first cabin. This isn't the first lake. This isn't the first story. I felt the cabin's air shift. The tapping sound grew louder, and I realized it was not coming from one wall anymore. It was coming from all around me, from the floor, from the ceiling, from the walls. Like the cabin was alive. Like the cabin was full of people behind the wood. I backed away from the fireplace and moved toward the door again. I tried the handle. It still didn't open. I pulled harder. The wood didn't move. I felt a sudden, sharp panic. I didn't want to be here. I didn't want to be trapped in a place where the lake had swallowed boats and people. I didn't want to be part of a story that had been happening for years. I sat down again, trying to calm my breathing. I told myself to think, to be logical, to stay calm. Then I heard something that made my blood run cold. A sound from outside the cabin. A cry. Not a scream, not a shout. A cry. A long, quiet sound that sounded like someone in pain, like someone calling for help. The cry came from the direction of the lake. It was faint, but it was real. It was human. My heart pounded in my chest. I stood up so fast I almost fell. I ran to the window and looked out. The lake was still. The ripples were there. The dark shape under the water was still moving slowly, but there was no sign of a person. The cry came again. Closer. I pressed my hands to the window, my breath fogging the glass. I stared at the water, trying to see the source. Then I realized something that made my stomach drop. The cry wasn't coming from the lake. It was coming from the cabin, from inside the walls. I stood there frozen, listening to the sound. It was a cry, but it was too soft, too far away, like it was coming from a distance that didn't make sense. I felt the tapping stop. The cabin went silent. And in that silence, I understood the worst part. The cabin was not just connected to the lake. The cabin was the lake. The moon was the only light left that night. I could see it through the cabin window, low and round, hanging over the lake like a pale coin. It was the kind of moon that made everything look softer, like the world had been washed in silver. It made the trees look calm. It made the water look calm. But calm was not the same as safe. I sat on the floor near the window, staring at the lake. I hadn't slept. I couldn't sleep. The cabin felt too alive, too aware. Every creak in the wood sounded like a whisper. Every shift in the air felt like a breath. I kept thinking about the list of names, the dates, the notes, the way every entry ended with the same words, "Boat disappeared." I kept thinking about the cry I heard from inside the walls, the way it sounded like someone far away, yet close enough to touch, the way it made my skin crawl. And I kept thinking about the lake. It wasn't just water. It was something else, something that had been waiting. I watched the moon's reflection in the lake. It was bright, clear, and steady. It looked like a second moon under the water, perfectly aligned with the real one. Then slowly, the reflection began to blur. At first I thought it was just a ripple, the wind, something small moving on the surface. But the blur didn't spread like a ripple, it spread like a shadow. The moon's reflection began to fade. I stared, my heart beating hard in my chest. I watched the reflection shrink, like someone was pulling it down. And then, with a sudden, quiet finality, it was gone. The lake was dark. Not just dark, but empty, like the water had swallowed the moon. I felt a cold wave of fear wash over me. The air in the cabin grew heavier. The silence grew thicker. The world outside felt like it had disappeared. I stood up slowly, my legs shaking. I walked to the window and pressed my forehead against the glass. I tried to see what had happened. The water was still. The ripples were gone. The lake looked like a flat black mirror reflecting nothing. The cabin's windows had always been strange, but now they felt wrong. They didn't reflect the world outside. They only reflected the darkness. I backed away from the window, my breath coming fast and shallow. I felt like I was standing at the edge of something I shouldn't be near. I looked at the walls. The tapping had stopped. The cabin was silent. For a moment, I thought the silence was a relief, a sign that maybe the worst was over. Then I heard it. A sound from the lake. It wasn't a ripple, it wasn't a wave, it was a voice. Soft, slow, almost like someone was speaking underwater. It said my name. Not loudly, not with anger, not with a shout. Just my name, spoken like a memory. Kashif. I froze, my blood turned cold. I didn't move, I didn't breathe, I didn't blink. The voice came again. Kashif. It sounded closer, like it was moving toward the cabin. My mind tried to make sense of it. I told myself it was the wind. I told myself it was my imagination. I told myself the cabin was playing tricks on me. But the voice sounded too real, too clear. I stepped closer to the window again. I pressed my hand to the glass. The cold of the window seeped into my skin. I stared at the water. And then I saw something I didn't want to see. Not a reflection, not a shadow. A face. It was not a face on the surface. It was a face under the water looking up. The features were blurred like someone had been in the water too long. The eyes were dark like holes. The mouth was open but not in a scream, in a shape that looked like it was trying to form words. The face moved closer to the glass. It pressed itself against the water's surface, and the lake seemed to bulge outward like a living thing. I stumbled back, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would break my ribs. The voice came again, louder now but still soft. Kashif. The name was spoken with a strange familiarity, like someone who had known me for a long time, like someone who had been waiting for me. I tried to run to the door, but my feet felt heavy, like I was moving through water. I grabbed the handle and pulled. The door didn't move. I pulled again, harder. The wood held firm. I turned, and for a moment I saw something in the cabin that I hadn't noticed before. A second door. It was not on the same wall as the first. It was small, like a closet door. It was half hidden behind the curtain. I walked toward it, my hands trembling. I reached for the handle. It was cold. I opened the door slowly. Inside was a narrow space. Not a closet, not a storage area, a passage. It was dark, but I could see the faint outline of stairs leading down. I didn't know why, but I felt like the passage had always been there, like it was part of the cabin, part of the lake. The voice came again from the water. Kashif. This time, the voice sounded like it was right behind me, like someone had moved from the lake to the cabin. I turned quickly, my heart pounding. The room was empty, but I felt a presence. Something close, something watching. I looked back at the passage. The stairs seemed to lead down into the darkness. The air coming from the passage was cold and damp, like a basement. I didn't want to go down. I didn't want to go anywhere near whatever was under the cabin. But the voice called my name again. And this time, there was something else with it. A whisper. Not words, just a sound, a breath, a feeling. Like someone was waiting at the bottom of the stairs. I stood there frozen, trying to decide what to do. I tried to tell myself to stay away. I tried to tell myself to leave. I tried to tell myself to be strong. But my body moved on its own. I stepped toward the passage. I took the first step down. The air grew colder. The darkness grew thicker. The sound of the lake faded, replaced by a quiet dripping sound, like water falling from the ceiling. I took another step. And another. The stairs seemed to go on forever. I felt like I was walking into the belly of the lake. The voice called my name again, but now it sounded different. Not like a human voice, more like something underwater trying to imitate speech. Kashif. The whisper was closer now. It was not coming from the lake. It was coming from the walls, from the stairs, from the air. I reached the bottom of the stairs and stepped into a room. It was small, bare. The walls were made of rough wood. The floor was wet. In the center of the room was a pool of water. The water was dark like the lake. It was still like a mirror. And in the water I saw the moon. Not a reflection. The moon itself, floating in the black water, as if it had been pulled down from the sky. The moon was dim, like it was dying. I felt a sudden, sharp fear. I realized what had happened. The lake had taken the moon. The cabin had taken the moon. And now it was holding it here. I stepped closer to the pool, my heart pounding. I looked into the water. The face was there again. Closer now. The eyes were empty, the mouth open. And the face spoke. Not with words. With a sound that was more like a feeling. Like the lake was speaking through it. I felt my name in the water. I felt it in my bones. And then, softly, the voice said something I will never forget. Come down. The voice was not a command. It was an invitation. It was a promise. It was the sound of something that had been waiting for me all along. I stood there frozen, staring into the dark water. The moon above was gone. The lake was silent, and the voice was calling me from beneath the surface. The morning was quiet when we set out. Mist curled along the edges of the trees, and the air smelled damp, earthy, like the forest itself was still waking. We were 4 friends, full of energy and excitement, armed with rifles and a plan that felt simple enough. Spend a day hunting, come back with a story, maybe a deer if luck favored us. I remember thinking, as I tightened my boots and checked my rifle, that this was the kind of day we'd tell people about later, laughing. I didn't know laughter would be so far from our future. The first hours passed uneventfully. Birds called softly between the trees. The ground was slick in patches of moss, and every step made a faint squelching sound. We moved slowly, deliberately, scanning for movement, listening for rustling leaves that might signal a deer. But around noon, something shifted. Not suddenly, but subtly, like the forest was stretching its limbs and settling into something heavier. We noticed a silence that wasn't natural. The usual chatter of small animals gone, the birds gone. Even the wind seemed to pause as though waiting. It was Raj who noticed first. He stopped mid-step, eyes scanning a distant ridge, and said nothing for several minutes. We waited, unsure whether to ask or remain quiet. I remember the chill that ran down my spine as I realized he wasn't looking at any animal. He was looking at something deeper in the woods, something hidden by shadow. I remember asking him if he was okay. He said yes, but there was tension in his voice that made my stomach twist. By late afternoon, the forest had grown denser. Sunlight pierced the canopy in sharp slants, highlighting mist and leaves like fragments of glass. It was easy to lose your bearings, even with a map or compass. That's when things started going wrong. We had been moving along a narrow path when Ravi, the youngest, stopped suddenly. He bent down, pointing at something half covered by leaves and mud. A deer track, no larger, human. At first we laughed it off, joking about someone who had gotten lost. But as we followed the tracks briefly, something felt off. The prints were uneven, like someone had been dragging something or someone. The thought made the hair on my arms prickle. I said nothing, but I felt a pull of unease, the kind that creeps up your back and settles in your gut. By dusk, we realized we had veered off our intended path. The familiar landmarks were gone, replaced by shadows and gnarled trees that all looked the same. We tried calling out, hoping to hear a response, a laugh, something from the group. Silence answered us. Then Raj said it quietly, almost in disbelief. Ravi. We turned, searching, and there was no one. Just mist curling at the base of the trees, the fatting light reflecting off wet leaves. My throat went dry. We shouted his name, pounding through the trees, but nothing came back. Not even an echo. Only silence, thick and suffocating, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. Panic began to settle in, but we tried to keep it contained. We argued about whether to search further or head back. By instinct, we agreed to keep moving forward, hopping to find shelter, a cabin, anything that could give us some sense of direction. That's when we saw it, the cabin. Small, wooden, partially hidden among thick evergreens, almost invisible unless you were looking directly at it. It looked abandoned, weathered, with a moss-covered roof and windows dark as soot. But something about it seemed deliberate, purposeful, like it had been waiting. We approached cautiously. The door was slightly ajar, swinging silently in the still evening air. No light, no smoke, nothing human, but the place didn't feel empty. I remember my hands shaking as I pushed the door wider, peering inside. The air was cold, damp, and smelled of old wood and fire long gone out. There were marks on the floor, footprints in the dust, suggesting recent presence, but no one was there. Not yet. The cabin was small. A rough-hewn table in the center, 2 chairs knocked slightly off balance, and a stone fireplace with the remnants of ashes scattered across the hearth. Against one wall, there were shelves lined with jars, empty and dusty, but arranged as if someone had taken care to organize them. Everything seemed ordinary enough, yet the quiet hum of unease we carried from the forest seemed to settle and thicken inside the cabin. It was like stepping into a place that remembered more than it should. We huddled together, debating what to do next. We considered leaving, running back into the trees, but darkness was falling fast. The woods were no longer a familiar place. They were a maze of shadows and murmurs. And then we remembered Ravi. He hadn't been seen for hours. Every minute we hesitated felt like another minute he could be slipping further into danger. So we stayed. We stayed and searched. The cabin offered little comfort. Drawers were mostly empty except for an old journal on the table. The pages were brittle, filled with writing in a careful hand, detailing years of someone's life in isolation. At first, it seemed mundane, but then we noticed entries about missing travelers, about things seen moving in the woods, and warnings about a lake nearby that had claimed more than one person. The words were unnerving. We tried to laugh it off as stories, old superstitious tales, but the tone was wrong. It wasn't a story, it was a record, a warning, and it was staring us in the face. Night fell completely while we were inside. The wind picked up outside, rattling the wooden walls. Shadows shifted in ways that didn't match the movement of the cabin. We could hear small, almost imperceptible noises, a floorboard creaking where no one was standing, a faint tap like a finger against the wall, the kind of sound that makes you hold your breath even when you tell yourself it's nothing. I couldn't shake the feeling that the cabin itself was alive, or at least aware, watching. We made a plan. One of us would stay with the door, the others would look outside for clues. I volunteered to stay, though I didn't know why, except that fear seemed to root me in place. I wanted to see, to understand, to witness what was happening. I wanted to see the cabin and the woods and the shadows fully before they swallowed us completely. Hours passed like that. Every small sound was magnified. Every shadow carried a possibility. I could hear Raj and the others moving outside, their voices muffled by the thick trees calling out, searching. And I could hear something else. A soft, distant voice whispering my name just enough to make me question if it was real. I told myself it was. It had to be the wind. It had to be the echo of our own fears. But the voice persisted, patient, insistent, almost human. Then near midnight we heard a scream, sharp, not far from the cabin. Raj ran inside, eyes wide, words tumbling out. "It's him. I found him. He's there." But no one came through the door. No one appeared. Only the echo of a scream fading into the trees, leaving a silence heavier than before. We were paralyzed, staring at one another, knowing that Ravi had vanished again. And this time it felt like the forest, like the cabin itself, had taken him. I remember sitting by the fireplace, hands on the table, listening to the dark. The journal lay open before me, words blurred and twisted in my mind. Names, dates, disappearances, warnings. The lake, the woods, the cabin, they were all part of something I couldn't yet name. Something that had claimed Ravi and might be waiting for the rest of us. I don't remember falling asleep, though I must have. When I woke, the first light of dawn had begun to pierce the cabin through the windows. The forest outside seemed quieter, almost expectant. Raj and the others were still here, though pale and trembling. We didn't speak. We only packed silently and left the cabin, following the faint path back through the woods, all of us hoping the morning could erase the night. But it couldn't. The cabin stayed with us, the shadows stayed with us, and Ravi was gone. Even now, when I close my eyes at night, I can hear the faint tap of wood against wood, like a heartbeat, like the cabin is still there, still waiting, still calling. The cabin felt colder than the outside air, even though the sun was still high and the day was warm. That first thing I noticed was the temperature. It was like stepping into a refrigerator. Not the kind of cold that comes from winter, but a cold that sits in the bones. A cold that makes your teeth feel loose. We had made it inside after that night. After the way the forest seemed to swallow Ravi. After the way the cabin stood there like it had been waiting for us, like it was built for this moment, like it knew we would come. The door shut behind us with a soft click, not loud, not dramatic, just a small sound like the cabin had accepted us. The air inside was still, not a breeze, not a draft, just stillness. It felt like the cabin was holding its breath. We stood there for a moment, staring at each other. Raj was shaking. The others looked pale. Everyone's eyes kept flicking to the floor, as if the floor might move. The room smelled like old smoke and damp wood, like someone had been living here then suddenly stopped, like someone had left in a hurry, like someone had vanished. I stepped forward, my boots making a soft sound on the floorboards. The wood was rough and uneven. It looked old but not rotted. It looked like it had been taken care of, even if the rest of the cabin had been left to time. I looked down and froze. There were stains, dark stains. Not fresh, not bright red, but dark, almost black, like the blood had dried long ago. The stains were scattered across the floor in a way that suggested movement, like someone had been dragged, like someone had tried to stand then fell again. The first stain was near the door. The second stain was closer to the fireplace. The third stain was near the table. It was like a trail. I felt my stomach twist. I looked at Raj and I could see his face change, the way his eyes widened, the way his mouth tightened. He had seen it too. The same thought hit both of us at the same time. Someone had been hurt here. Someone had been hurt badly. The cabin felt smaller all of a sudden, like the walls were leaning in, like the air was pressing down on us. I walked closer to the table. The stains led right past it. The floor around the table was darker, like there had been a struggle. I ran my fingers over the wood, careful not to touch the stain. The wood was cold. It felt like it had been cold for a long time. It felt like the cold had soaked into the wood itself. I stood up and looked around. The room was sparse. There was a chair knocked over near the fireplace. The shelves on the wall had jars and bottles, all empty but neatly arranged. The only thing that looked out of place was a small pile of clothing in the corner, old, faded, and stained. I walked over slowly. The clothing was folded neatly, like someone had put it there on purpose. It looked like a uniform, like a hunting jacket, similar to the ones we were wearing. My hands started to shake. I picked up the jacket carefully. It was heavy, stiff, and smelled like old sweat. There was a patch on the sleeve, a small symbol like a circle with a line through it. I had seen that symbol before, in the journal, in the other cabin. It was like a signature, like a mark left by whoever owned this place. I put the jacket down and stepped back, my heart pounding. I didn't want to touch anything else. I didn't want to be here, but we were already here. We had already crossed the line. Raj spoke quietly, almost in a whisper. We shouldn't be here. I nodded, but I didn't know if I agreed, because even though I was scared, I felt a strange pull, like the cabin was calling us, like it wanted us to see. The air felt heavier. The cold pressed against my skin. I could see my breath in the dim light, even though it was summer, even though it was warm outside. I looked at the floor again. The stains looked darker now. The longer I stared, the more they seemed to change, like the wood was remembering. I tried to shake the thought away. I told myself it was just old blood, old stains, a story from long ago, nothing that should matter to us. But the cabin didn't feel like an old place. It felt like a place that had been used recently, like someone had been here not long ago, like the stains were still fresh in the wood's memory. I walked to the fireplace and looked inside. The ashes were cold, but there was something else, a small pile of charred paper. I pulled it out carefully. The paper was blackened, but I could still see writing on it. A few words, a name, a date. Ravi. My heart skipped. I stared at the name, unable to breathe. It was like the cabin was mocking us, like it was telling us it knew what had happened, like it was showing us the proof. I looked at the others. They were all staring at the floor, at the walls, at the air. Their faces were pale and tense. The fear was building, but it wasn't the kind of fear that made you run. It was the kind of fear that made you listen. Listen to the silence. Listen to the cabin. I walked back to the table and picked up the journal again. I had read it before, but I hadn't really looked at it closely. Now I needed to know what it said. I needed to understand. The pages were filled with writing, and the handwriting looked like it had been written by someone who was losing their mind slowly. The words were careful, but the tone was desperate. There were entries about people disappearing, about hearing voices, about the lake. One entry caught my eye. It was underlined as if the writer wanted to make sure it was remembered. The cabin is not a shelter, it is a trap. The floor remembers, the walls listen, the lake takes what it wants. I read the sentence again, and the words seemed to sink into the wood beneath me, like the cabin was listening to me read them. The air felt colder, the silence deeper. The cabin seemed to shift slightly, like it was settling. I looked down at the floor. The stains looked like they were moving. Not in a real way, not like liquid, but like a memory, like the wood was replaying the struggle over and over again. I felt my stomach turn. I wanted to leave. I wanted to run back into the forest and never come back, but I couldn't move. I was stuck, like my feet were glued to the floor. Raj spoke again, his voice shaking. "We need to leave." I nodded, but I didn't know how. The cabin had already closed itself around us. The door was still shut, the air still cold, the walls still watching. Then I heard it. A sound from under the floor. A faint, slow scraping, like nails dragged across wood, like something moving beneath us. My breath caught. I stared at the floor and the sound grew louder. The floorboards creaked as if something was shifting underneath. The sound came again, closer. Then a low, soft whisper. Not a voice, not words, just a sound like someone trying to speak but failing, like a mouth underwater. I backed away, my hands shaking. I looked at the others and I saw the same fear in their eyes, the same realization. The cabin wasn't just a place. It was a living thing. Something inside the wood was trying to get out. Something that had been trapped for a long time. I didn't know what it was, but I knew one thing for sure. It wanted us. The cold pressed harder against my skin. The air grew thick. The silence turned into a weight, and the floorboards continued to whisper. As if they were remembering the struggle. As if they were calling for someone to join them. I don't know how long we stayed in that cabin. Time seemed to stretch. The cold made everything feel slow. The fear made every second feel like a minute. But eventually, we made a decision. We would leave. We would go back into the forest. We would find Ravi. Or we would die trying. We gathered our things, and we moved toward the door. But when we reached it, the handle was cold. Too cold, like it had been touched by someone else. And the door wouldn't open. The cabin held its breath. And we realized we were not alone. The cabin's air was still cold, even after we had tried to force ourselves to leave. It felt like the cold had soaked into the walls, into the floor, into the bones of the place itself. The longer we stayed, the more it felt like the cabin was pressing on us, like it was trying to keep us inside. We were all breathing hard, but not from running, from fear. From the realization that we had stepped into something that was not meant for us. The door still wouldn't open. We pulled, pushed, slammed it, but it didn't budge. It was like the cabin had decided to keep us. We backed away from the door, and that's when Raj noticed the small crack in the wall near the fireplace. A thin line in the wood that looked like a seam, like something had been hidden behind it. I remember the way his eyes narrowed, the way he leaned closer, as if he was trying to see through the wall. He reached out and pressed his fingers along the seam. The wood was cold. The seam was almost invisible, but it was there. He pushed gently. The wall gave way. A hidden door slid open, revealing a narrow space behind it. It wasn't a closet. It was deeper. It was darker. We stood there staring at it. The air that came from inside was colder. Even colder than the cabin. It smelled like old paper and dust, like a place that hadn't been touched in years. For a moment, none of us moved. We just listened. The silence was heavy, like the cabin was waiting for us to make a choice. Finally, Raj whispered, "We need to see." I wanted to say no. I wanted to say we should leave. I wanted to say anything that would keep us away from whatever was inside, but I didn't say it, because part of me was already walking into the darkness. We stepped inside the hidden room. It was small, like a storage room, but the walls were covered with photographs, hundreds of them. Each photo was pinned to the wall with a small nail. The photos were old, faded, and some were torn, but the images were clear enough to make my skin crawl. The photos showed people. Not animals, not deer, not bears, people. Men and women standing in the woods. Some were smiling, some looked terrified, some were alone, some were with other people. All of them looked like they were being watched. I walked closer to one of the photos. It showed a man standing near a tree, looking at the camera. His eyes were wide and his mouth was slightly open. He looked like he had been caught in the middle of something, like he was about to run. Beneath the photo, there was a note. It was written in the same handwriting as the journal. The letters were careful, but the tone was cold. Human tracked, location confirmed. I felt my stomach twist. I looked at the next photo. Another person, another note. Human tracked, movement observed. The notes continued. Some had dates, some had names, some had both. It was like someone had been keeping a record of people, like they had been hunting them. Not animals, humans. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding. The room felt smaller, like the walls were closing in. The photographs seemed to stare at me. The eyes in the photos seemed to follow my movement. I looked at the floor. There were marks, scratches, like someone had dragged something across the wood, like someone had been held down, like someone had fought. The air in the room felt thick, like the cabin had been hiding something for a long time, like it had been waiting for us to find it. I turned to Raj, my voice barely a whisper. "What is this?" Raj didn't answer. He was staring at a table in the corner of the room. On the table were notebooks and papers stacked neatly. There was a lamp, but it was broken. There were more notes and a map. The map showed the area around the cabin, the forest, the lake, the paths. There were small marks on the map like a trail, like someone had been tracking movement. I picked up one of the notebooks. The cover was worn. The pages inside were filled with writing. The handwriting was the same, but the tone was different. The writing looked more frantic, like the writer had been losing control. I read a few lines. "They keep returning. They keep coming back. They don't know they're being watched. They think they are alone." I looked up, my skin crawling. The notes continued. "The cabin is the anchor. The lake is the lure. The forest is the trap." My hands were shaking. I put the notebook down and looked at the photos again. One photo stood out. It was different from the rest. It wasn't faded. It wasn't torn. It was recent. The paper looked new. The image was sharp. It showed 4 people. 4 friends. Standing in the woods. Their faces were turned toward the camera. They were smiling. I felt my blood run cold. The faces were ours. Our faces. It was a photo of us, taken from the front, like someone had been standing in front of us, watching. The note beneath it was simple. "New subject, tracking begins." I couldn't breathe. I stumbled back, my hand reaching out to grab the wall for support. My heart was beating so hard I thought it would break through my ribs. The room felt like it was spinning. Raj stepped closer to the photo, his eyes wide. He whispered, "That's not possible." But it was possible. It was real. The cabin had been watching us. The cabin had been waiting for us. The notes on the table were like a plan, like a record of a long process. The writer had been tracking humans for a long time. They had been following people into the woods. They had been watching them. They had been waiting for them to come to the cabin. And now we were here. I looked at the map again. The marks on it seemed to move in my mind, like a path, like a trail, like a hunting route. The lake was marked with a dark circle. The cabin was marked with a small dot. The forest was filled with lines. I realized something that made my blood go cold. The map was not a map. It was a trap, a guide, a record, a way to find people. And the cabin was the center of it. The room felt colder. The air felt heavier. The photographs seemed to press closer, like they were trying to speak, like they were trying to tell me something. I heard a sound from the cabin outside. A soft tap, like a finger against wood. It was slow, steady, patient, like someone was waiting. I turned to the others, my voice shaking. "We need to leave, now." Raj nodded, but he looked like he wanted to stay, like he wanted to understand, like he wanted to know who had done this. I could feel the cabin pulling at us, pulling at our curiosity, pulling at our fear. We moved toward the hidden door. But before we could leave, I saw one more note on the table. It was written in large letters, like a warning. "Do not follow the sound. Do not go near the water. The lake takes what it wants." The words were simple. The warning was clear. But the cabin had already taken something from us. It had taken our safety. It had taken our peace. It had taken our belief that we were safe in the woods. We left the hidden room and returned to the main cabin. The door still wouldn't open. The air was still cold. The floor still held its stains. The walls still listened. And the photographs still watched. I don't know how long we stayed in that cabin after that. I don't know how long we waited, trapped in the cold, listening to the sound of the forest outside, listening to the cabin's quiet breathing. All I know is this: we were not just lost. We were being tracked. And the cabin was the hunter. I heard the gunshot before I understood what it was. It was not loud. It wasn't the kind of gunshot that makes your ears ring and your heart jump into your throat. It was distant, muffled by trees and night air, like the sound had traveled through layers of forest before reaching us, like it had been made far away, then dragged toward us slowly. At first I thought it was a branch snapping, or a rock falling, or the wind, but the sound had that sharpness, that quickness, that final crack that only a gun can make. The moment it hit the air, something in my body changed. My muscles tightened. My breath stopped. The others heard it too. I could feel it in the way they all froze. Raj's eyes went wide. He looked at me, then at the door, then at the windows, like he was trying to find where the sound had come from. For a long moment, none of us moved. The cabin was silent. The kind of silence that comes after a loud sound, when the world holds its breath. Then the silence deepened. It wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, like the air had been poured into a cup and left to settle, like the forest was listening. I looked at the others. Their faces were pale. Their eyes were unfocused. Their hands were shaking. We all knew the same thing. The hunter was still out there. And he knew we were here. We had been trapped in the cabin for hours, listening to the cold air and the quiet, trying to understand what was happening. We had found the hidden room, the photographs, the notes, the map, the record of tracking humans. We had realized the cabin was not just a shelter. It was a trap, a hunting ground. And now the gunshot proved something worse. The hunter was not just a memory. He was real. He was watching. The gunshot was a warning. Not a mistake, not a random sound. A message. We stood in the cabin, staring at each other, not knowing what to do. The door still wouldn't open. The windows still reflected darkness. The air was still cold. The floor still held its stains. The hunter had made his presence known. And he had done it from far away. I remember thinking in that moment that we had never been alone, that the cabin had been waiting for us, that the hunter had been watching us even before we arrived, that the woods had been part of the trap. I tried to think logically. I tried to convince myself that the gunshot could have been from someone else, a hunter passing by, a hunter in another part of the forest, but the feeling in my chest wouldn't let me. The gunshot had a purpose. It was aimed at us. The silence after the gunshot was the worst part, because it made the world feel empty. It made the forest feel like a mouth closing. The silence was not quiet, it was full of meaning. I could hear the small sounds inside the cabin, the creak of the wood, the soft rustle of clothing, the shallow breathing of my friends, the faint tapping in the walls like the cabin was remembering. I walked to the window and pressed my hand to the glass. The cold pressed back. The lake outside was still dark. The trees were still. I looked into the forest trying to see something, trying to see movement, trying to see a figure. But there was nothing. Just darkness. Just silence. The gunshot had not been followed by footsteps, not by voices, not by any sign that someone had moved closer. It was like the hunter had fired from far away, just to remind us he was there. I turned away from the window, my heart beating hard. I could feel my body trembling, even though I was trying to stay calm. I could feel the fear in my bones, the fear that had been building since Ravi disappeared, the fear that had been growing since we found the cabin, the fear that we were not just lost. We were being hunted. Raj whispered, "He's still watching." I nodded, but I couldn't speak. My throat felt tight. The words wouldn't come out. The others were silent too. We all knew that the hunter had not come to kill us immediately. That wasn't his style. The hunter was patient. The hunter wanted us to feel the fear. The hunter wanted us to know we were being tracked. The cabin had been a trap for humans. The hunter had been keeping records, tracking movement, watching, waiting. And now, he was reminding us of his presence. We moved slowly through the cabin, searching for any sign of a way out. The hidden room had already shown us the truth. The photographs had shown us that we were not the first. The notes had shown us that the cabin was part of a larger plan. But we still didn't know where the hunter was. We still didn't know how close he was. We still didn't know what he wanted. We only knew that he was out there, and that he was patient. The silence after the gunshot made the cabin feel even more alive. The air seemed to press in. The walls seemed to lean closer. The floor seemed to hold its breath. I could feel the cabin watching us. I could feel the hunter watching us. I could feel the forest listening. The minutes passed slowly. The silence remained. The gunshot became a memory that sat in the air like a weight. We waited, expecting to hear something else. Another shot, a voice, a footstep. But nothing came. The hunter didn't move. He didn't need to. He was already winning. Because we were trapped, the cabin wouldn't let us out. The forest was a maze. The lake was a lure. The hunter had already set the trap. We were inside it. And we were helpless. I remember thinking about Ravi. I remember thinking about the way he had vanished. I remember thinking about the scream, the way it had sounded like he was close, then gone. I realized something then. The hunter didn't need to kill us to win. He only needed to make us afraid, to make us feel hunted, to make us understand that we were not safe, even in the cabin, even in the place we had thought would save us. The silence after the gunshot was the worst kind of silence. It wasn't empty. It was full of the hunter's presence. It was full of the knowledge that we were being watched. And it was full of the certainty that we were not going to leave. Not easily. Not alive. I looked at my friends. I saw the fear in their eyes. I saw the way they were trying to stay calm. I saw the way they were trying to pretend that the hunter was not real. But the hunter was real. The cabin was real. The forest was real. And the feeling of being hunted was real. We didn't hear the hunter again that night. We didn't hear footsteps. We didn't hear voices. We didn't hear any signs that he was close. But the silence was still there. It followed us like a shadow. It sat in the corners of the cabin. It pressed against the walls. It made every sound feel louder, every movement feel watched, every breath feel like it was being listened to. The next morning, when the sun finally rose, the cabin looked like any other cabin. The woods looked like any other woods. The lake looked like any other lake. But we knew the truth. We knew the cabin was a trap. We knew the hunter was out there. And we knew that we were not alone. We left the cabin that morning, but the feeling of being hunted stayed with us. It stayed in our minds. It stayed in our bones. It stayed in our hearts. The hunter never showed himself. The hunter never needed to, because the fear he left behind was enough. And even now, when I hear a distant sound in the woods, when I see a shadow move, when I feel the air grow colder, I remember the silence after the gunshot. And I remember that the hunter is still out there, still watching, still waiting. And that feeling of being hunted never leaves. The storm came fast, like a wall closing in. One moment the sky was a dull gray, the trees standing still in the cold. The next moment, the wind rose like a beast, pushing the snow into my face with enough force to make my eyes water. The path I had been following disappeared. The trail markers vanished under a thick layer of white. The forest turned into a blur of white and black. I tried to keep moving, but every step felt like I was walking through a deep, shifting ocean. The snow was soft, but it kept pulling at my boots. My fingers were numb, my ears burned, and my breath came out in sharp, foggy bursts. I told myself I would find shelter. I told myself the storm would end. I told myself I could make it. But I knew deep down that I was already losing. I had been hiking for hours, following a trail I thought I knew. I had been alone for most of the day. The quiet had been comforting at first, like the forest was a safe place. But then the storm had started, and the forest became something else. The trees began to look like shadows. The wind sounded like a distant voice. The snow fell like a curtain, hiding everything. The world had narrowed down to the space right in front of me, and even that space was uncertain. I stopped for a moment and tried to listen. The wind was loud. The snow was loud. The storm seemed to have its own rhythm. It felt like the forest was breathing. I took off my gloves and checked my phone, even though I knew it was pointless. No signal, no GPS. The screen was freezing, the battery dropping fast. I looked up and tried to see the sky, but the snow covered everything. The world was a white blur. I thought about turning back, but I didn't know where back was. I thought about staying where I was, but I knew that would only make things worse. I was cold. I was tired. I was lost. I kept moving. The wind pushed against me and the snow slapped my face. My eyes stung. My legs burned with the effort of walking through deep snow. My mind started to feel heavy, like my thoughts were being dragged down. I began to see shapes in the storm. Not real shapes, but illusions created by the wind and the snow. A tree that looked like a person. A rock that looked like a face. A shadow that looked like a door. I tried to ignore them. I tried to focus on my steps. But the storm was too strong. It made everything look strange. Then, through the blizzard, I saw something that didn't belong. A warm golden light. At first I thought it was a trick, a flare, a fire, something my mind was creating to give me hope. But the light stayed there, steady, glowing through the snow like a small star. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and looked again. The light was still there. It was coming from a cabin that seemed to appear out of nowhere, glowing in the storm. The walls were dark, but the windows were lit with a soft, warm glow. The cabin looked like it was made of wood, but the light made it look unreal, like it was not part of the forest. It was like a mirage, like something I was seeing only because I was cold and tired and scared. I stopped walking and stared at it. My mind tried to make sense of it. A cabin in the middle of a storm, a cabin I had never seen before, a cabin that shouldn't be there. But the light was real. I could feel it. It was a warmth that reached my face even through the wind. It was the kind of warmth that makes your skin feel alive again. I took a step forward. The snow shifted under my boots. The wind pushed me. My body shook with cold. But I kept moving. The cabin seemed to stay in the same place, no matter how far I walked. The storm tried to hide it, but the light remained. It was like the cabin was waiting for me. As I got closer, I noticed something strange. The snow around the cabin was different. It was not as deep. It looked like it had been trampled, like someone had walked around the cabin recently. The snow was packed down as if someone had moved through it. I stopped and looked around. The forest was quiet. The storm still raged, but the area near the cabin felt calmer, as if the wind had softened. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't explain why the cabin felt like a promise. I couldn't explain why I felt like I had been drawn to it. I walked to the door and reached out with my frozen hand. The wood was cold, but it was solid. The door was old, but it didn't look abandoned. It looked like it had been used. I knocked. The sound was muffled by the storm, but it echoed inside the cabin. The light inside flickered. I waited. Nothing happened. I knocked again, harder. Still nothing. My heart started to race. I felt a sudden rush of fear. What if no one was inside? What if the cabin was empty? What if the light was just a trick? I put my ear to the door and listened. I heard nothing. No movement, no breathing, no sound of a fire, no sound of anything. The silence was strange. It was too quiet. The storm was loud outside, but inside the cabin there was no sound at all. I felt my skin go cold, even though I was already freezing. I took a deep breath and pushed the door. It opened easily. The warmth rushed out, hitting my face like a wave. I stepped inside and felt my body relax for the first time since the storm began. The air was warm, but it had a strange, damp smell, like wet wood and old smoke. The cabin was small. It had a simple layout: a table, a few chairs, a fireplace, and a bed. The light came from a single lamp hanging from the ceiling. The lamp glowed softly, like it had been lit for a long time. I looked around, trying to understand where the sound of the cabin had gone. The cabin was empty. No one was inside. No one was waiting for me. But the cabin felt alive. The walls seemed to breathe. The floorboards creaked softly under my weight. The air felt heavy, like it had been holding onto something for a long time. I walked to the fireplace and saw that it was cold. There were ashes in the hearth, but no fire. The logs looked like they had been there for a long time. The dust on them was thick. I looked at the bed. The blankets were folded neatly, as if someone had made it recently. The pillow looked unused, but the bed looked like it had been slept in. I felt a chill run down my spine. I stepped closer to the bed and saw something on the pillow. A note. A small piece of paper folded neatly. The edges were worn, like it had been handled many times. I picked it up with my gloved hand and opened it. The words were written in a shaky, uneven hand. Welcome. The letters were simple, almost childish, but the message felt wrong. It felt like it had been written by someone who was trying to sound friendly, but who was not. I looked around the cabin again, my heart pounding. The light from the lamp seemed to flicker, just for a moment. The shadows in the corners of the room shifted, like something had moved. I told myself it was just the storm outside. I told myself it was just my imagination. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the cabin was not empty. That something was watching me. That something had been waiting for me. I looked back at the door. The storm outside was still raging. The wind still howled. The snow still fell. But the cabin was calm. Too calm. And the silence inside felt like a trap. I sat down at the table, my hands still shaking. I tried to warm them by rubbing them together. I tried to think of a plan. I tried to convince myself that I was safe. But the cabin had already made its first move. It had lured me inside. And now I could feel it. The feeling of being watched. The feeling of being not alone. The feeling that I had stepped into something I couldn't understand. Something that was not just a shelter. Something that was waiting. Something that wanted me to stay. The storm continued outside. And inside the cabin, the silence grew heavier. I realized with a sudden sinking certainty that the cabin was not a refuge. It was the beginning of something else. And I had just walked into it. The warmth in the cabin didn't feel like warmth from a fire. It felt like warmth from a memory. Like the kind of heat you feel when you remember being safe, even if you're not. I stood there for a moment, staring at the note on the table, trying to make sense of the simple word that had been written in such a strange way. Welcome. The cabin was quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you notice every small sound. The wind outside hit the walls with a low, steady thump. The snow scraped against the windows like a hand dragging across glass. The cabin swayed slightly with the force of the storm, and the floorboards creaked under my weight. I tried to ignore it. I told myself I was just tired, that the storm had made my mind play tricks on me, that I was seeing shadows where there were none. But the moment I moved, the shadows seemed to move too. I walked toward the fireplace. The hearth was cold, but the air around it was warm. The warmth in the room seemed to come from nowhere. The lamp above the table glowed softly, but it didn't feel like it was the source of the heat. The logs in the fireplace were old. They looked dry, but they were blackened, as if they had been burned and then left to sit for years. There was ash in the hearth, but it was thick and heavy, like it had been there for a long time. I picked up a match from the small box on the table. The box was old, the paper faded. The matchsticks were uneven, like they had been broken by hand. My fingers shook as I struck the match. The flame appeared for a moment, bright and sharp. It flickered in the wind and then it died. I struck another match, same thing. The flame came, then vanished. It felt like the air itself was swallowing the fire. I tried a third match, and this time the flame held for a second longer. It lit the kindling, and for a moment I saw the wood catch. But then the flame stuttered like it was struggling. The fire didn't spread. It didn't grow. It just stayed there, small and weak, as if it didn't want to exist. I watched it, feeling my chest tighten. I expected the fire to grow, to fill the room with light, but it didn't. It stayed small, it stayed weak. The warmth in the cabin stayed the same, as if the fire was only pretending to burn. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch and bend, as if they were moving in a slow, deliberate way. The darkness near the ceiling looked deeper, thicker, like it was hiding something. I stepped closer to the fire and felt the heat on my face. It was warm, but it didn't feel real. It felt like the warmth you feel when you stand near a heater that has been turned on for too long, like the heat was trapped inside the air. I turned my head and looked around the cabin. The shadows were not just shadows anymore. They looked like shapes. Shapes that didn't belong to the room. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that the storm had made my mind unstable, that the cold had made me see things. But the shadows moved in a way that was too slow to be a trick, too deliberate. They shifted in the corners, as if something was walking behind the walls. I took a step toward the far wall near the bed, and the shadow there seemed to react. It pulled back as if it had been touched. I froze. My heart hammered in my chest. My breath came out in short, sharp bursts. I felt a cold sweat on my forehead, even though the room was warm. I told myself to stay calm, to stay rational. I told myself I was safe. But I didn't feel safe. I felt watched. I felt like the cabin had eyes. I turned back to the fireplace and stared at the fire again. The flame was still small, it was still struggling, but now it looked different. It looked like it was being held back, like something was keeping it from growing. I watched the flame flicker and tried to understand why it wouldn't burn. Then I noticed something in the ashes. A small piece of metal half buried. It looked like a ring or a key, something old. I reached down and picked it up. The metal was cold, and it felt heavy in my hand. It had a strange shape, like it had been carved by someone who didn't know what they were doing. I held it up to the light. The ring had a small engraving, barely visible. A symbol. It looked like a circle with a line through it. A simple mark, but it felt like it meant something. I felt a sudden wave of unease. The cabin felt different now, like it had changed because I had touched the ring. I looked at the shadows again. They seemed darker, denser, more solid. I set the ring down on the table and tried to focus on the room. I tried to think of a way to get out. I tried to think of a plan. But the cabin seemed to be closing in on me. The air felt heavier. The walls seemed closer. The light from the lamp flickered, just slightly, as if something had passed in front of it. I heard a sound. A soft sound, like someone breathing. It came from the corner of the room, near the bed. I turned slowly, trying not to make a sound. The shadow in that corner was moving again. It wasn't moving like a person. It was moving like something that was being pushed, like something was sliding along the wall. The sound of breathing grew louder, and I realized it wasn't breathing. It was the sound of something shifting, something trying to move through the darkness. My mind raced. I thought of the note. Welcome. I thought of the way the cabin had felt when I first walked in. I thought of the warmth that didn't come from the fire. I thought of the ring in the ashes. I thought of the shadows. I thought of the storm outside. I felt a sudden, terrible certainty. The cabin was not a refuge. It was a trap, and I had walked into it. I took a step backward toward the door. The door was still open and the storm outside still raged. The wind howled, the snow fell. The world outside was wild and dangerous. But I wanted to go back into the storm. I wanted the cold. I wanted the wind. I wanted anything that wasn't this. I reached for the door handle, but my hand stopped. I realized the door wasn't just open. It was waiting. The cabin was letting me go. Or it was letting me think I could go. The shadows in the corners seemed to lean toward me, as if they were listening, as if they were waiting for me to make a choice. I felt my throat tighten. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I wanted to run, but my legs felt heavy. I wanted to leave, but I didn't know if I could. I stood there holding the door handle, staring at the storm outside, and I realized something else. The storm outside was loud. The cabin inside was quiet. The quiet felt like a presence. The quiet felt like something that had been waiting for me. The fire still burned weakly. The shadows still moved. And the cabin still held its warmth, like a living thing. I pulled my hand away from the door. I didn't know why. I didn't know what I was doing. But I knew one thing. I wasn't going to leave. Not yet. Not while the cabin was still speaking to me in its silence. Not while the fire refused to burn. Not while the shadows moved in the corners, like something hiding just out of sight. I sat back down at the table, my hands trembling, and stared at the small flame in the fireplace. I watched it struggle. I watched it fight. And I realized that the fire wasn't the only thing that refused to burn. Something inside me refused to let go. Something inside me wanted to stay. And the cabin knew it. The storm outside continued to rage. But inside the cabin, the fire stayed weak, and the shadows kept moving, as if they were waiting for me to finally understand what it meant to be trapped in warmth that wasn't real. I didn't want to touch the wall. I knew in that moment that the act of touching it would change something, like a rule, like a line you weren't supposed to cross. But I did it anyway because the room felt like it was closing in on me, and I needed something to hold on to. My fingers pressed into the rough wood, and I felt the grooves under my skin. Names. They were carved into the wall, deep and old. Some of them were fresh, the wood still slightly raw around the letters. Others were faded, worn smooth by time and maybe by hands that had touched them again and again. I moved my hand along the wall slowly, like I was reading a book that didn't want to be read. The first name I saw was dated from years ago. The letters were thick, uneven. It looked like it had been carved by someone with a knife that wasn't very sharp. Mara 1998. Below it, another name. Lucas 2003. Another, June 2009. The dates kept going, one after another, like a list of people who had been here before me, like a record of visitors who had stayed too long. I swallowed, my throat tight. I had the strange feeling that these names weren't just names. They were warnings. I leaned closer, reading the carvings carefully. The wood smelled old, like it had been sealed for years. The room felt colder now, even though the cabin was warm. The air seemed to hold its breath. I moved my hand again, and my fingers brushed a name that made my stomach drop. It was carved deeper than the others. The letters were clear, as if the person who had carved it had been certain, had been calm, had been steady. My name 2024. My name. My own name, carved into the wall. I stared at it, unable to breathe for a moment. The letters looked like mine. The way the lines bent, the way the edges were sharp, it was unmistakable. I stepped back, my eyes wide. My hands trembled. I felt like the room had tilted. I read the date again. The year I was in now. I looked around the room, as if someone might be hiding behind the bed or under the floorboards, waiting to laugh at me, waiting to tell me it was a joke. But there was no one. Just the walls. Just the names. Just the silence. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. How could my name be here? How could someone have carved it before I arrived? How could someone know I would be here? I tried to think of something logical. Maybe someone had found me. Maybe someone had known my name. Maybe someone had carved it as a prank. But the more I looked, the more I realized it wasn't a prank. The name was carved in the same style as the others, the same deep, careful letters, the same way the wood had been cut. It looked like it belonged, like it had been there for a long time. I ran my fingers over the name again, and the wood felt strangely warm under my touch. Not hot, not burning, just warm, like it had been warmed by a hand that had held it. A hand that had been there recently. I stepped away from the wall, my heart pounding. I tried to control my breathing, to slow it down, to think. I looked at the other names again, the dates, the years. And then my name. It felt like the wall was telling me something. Like the cabin was showing me a timeline. Like it was keeping a record. I noticed something else then. The dates were not random. They were spaced out, like the cabin had been visited at certain times, like someone had been returning, like the cabin had been waiting. I looked at the names again, trying to see a pattern. Some of the names were repeated. Some had small marks next to them, like a check mark or a cross. Some had a small symbol next to them, like the same symbol I had seen on the ring in the ashes. The circle with the line through it. I felt a cold wave pass through me. The cabin was connected. Everything in it was connected. The ring, the fire, the shadows, the names. The cabin wasn't just a place, it was a system, a machine, a trap, a record. I tried to think of what the names meant. Were they people who had been lost, people who had been trapped, people who had been hunted? Or were they people who had been chosen? I couldn't tell, but the presence of my name made it clear. The cabin had been waiting for me. The cabin had known I would come. I sat down on the bed, my hands still shaking. I stared at the wall, at the names, at the dates. I felt a strange mixture of fear and curiosity. Fear because I didn't know what would happen next. Curiosity because I wanted to understand. I wanted to know why my name was there. I wanted to know who had carved it. I wanted to know what the cabin wanted from me. The room was quiet, but the silence felt heavy. The air seemed thicker. The shadows seemed closer. The warmth felt like a presence. I heard a faint sound, like a whisper, but it was so quiet I wasn't sure if it was real. I listened. The sound came again. A soft, almost inaudible whisper, like someone speaking from far away. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was familiar. It sounded like someone calling my name. My skin prickled. I stood up slowly, my heart beating hard. I walked toward the door, but I didn't open it. I didn't want to leave the room. I didn't want to go back into the cabin where the shadows moved and the fire refused to burn. But I also didn't want to stay. I turned back to the wall one last time, and I saw something I hadn't noticed before. Under my name, there was another line of text. It was faint, like it had been carved long ago and then worn away. I leaned closer, squinting. I could barely make out the letters, but I could see enough to understand. It said, "You are next." My breath caught in my throat. I stepped back, my heart racing. The words seemed to pulse in the wood like they were alive. I stared at the wall, at the names, at the dates, at my own name. And I realized something I didn't want to admit. The cabin was not just a trap. It was a prophecy, a warning, a record of what had happened, and what would happen. The storm outside continued to howl. The wind pressed against the cabin. The snow scraped against the windows. The world outside was harsh and dangerous. But the cabin inside was worse, because the cabin was waiting. And now it had my name. And I knew deep in my bones that I wasn't just lost in the storm. I was lost in something much older. Something that had been waiting for me. Something that had already written my name on the wall. And it was only a matter of time before it finished the rest. I left the room slowly, like I was afraid the walls would reach out and grab me if I moved too fast. The names on the wall still burned in my mind. The dates, the warnings, my name carved there like a promise. The words beneath it, faint but clear enough to read if you leaned close. "You are next." I stepped into the cabin's main room. The fire still burned weakly, the shadows still moving in the corners. The air still felt warm, but not like warmth from a fire, like warmth from something living. I didn't know what I expected to find. A door that had appeared, a path that led out, a sign that said, "You can leave now." But there was nothing. Just the cabin, just the warmth, just the silence. I stood in the middle of the room, feeling my body shake. I tried to calm myself. I tried to think. The storm outside had not stopped. I could hear the wind, the snow, the world still raging, the trail still lost. I walked to the door and opened it. The storm hit me like a wall. The cold air rushed in, sharp and biting. The snow whipped around my face. The wind made a low, angry sound like the world was warning me. I stepped outside. The cabin stood there for a moment in the blizzard, glowing softly like a mirage. The light from inside spilled out, warm and inviting like a promise. Then, as I watched, the cabin began to blur. Not like it was moving, like it was fading. The edges of the cabin softened, like someone had smudged a pencil drawing. The walls seemed to lose their shape. The roof looked like it was dissolving into the air. I blinked hard, thinking it was my eyes, thinking the storm was making me see things. But when I opened my eyes again, the cabin was gone. Just gone. The place where it had been was empty. There was only snow. Fresh snow, smooth and untouched. No footprints leading to the cabin. No tracks. No sign that it had ever been there. I stood there staring, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. The wind whipped around me. The snow fell in thick, heavy flakes. I looked around, trying to find any sign of the cabin, any hint that it had been real. But there was nothing. Just trees, just snow, just the storm. I turned slowly, looking back at the path I had come from. The trail was covered in snow now. The footprints I had made earlier were still there, leading away from the place where the cabin had been. But they didn't lead to the cabin. They led to nothing. The footprints stopped in the middle of the snow, like someone had stepped into the air and disappeared. I felt my stomach drop. I walked to the end of the footprints, my boots sinking into the snow. I looked down at the prints. They were clear, fresh. They showed my steps, the weight of my body, the direction I had walked. And then they ended. No more prints. Just snow. Just the storm. I looked around again, trying to understand. I thought maybe I had walked in circles. Maybe I had lost my sense of direction. Maybe the cabin had been a trick of the storm. But the footprints were real. My footprints. I could see them clearly. They ended at the place where the cabin had been. As if the cabin had swallowed the path. As if the cabin had never existed. I felt a cold wave of fear. Not because I was lost, but because I was being manipulated. Because something had decided I shouldn't leave. Because something had taken the cabin away. Or maybe it had never been a cabin at all. Maybe it had been a doorway. A door to something else. A door that could open and close at will. A door that could appear in the storm like a mirage. A door that could vanish when you tried to leave. I stood there in the snow, my breath fogging in the air. The storm was loud, but it didn't feel as loud as the silence inside me. I looked down at the place where the cabin had been, and I realized something. The snow around that spot was different. It was disturbed. Not like footprints. Like something had been dragged. Like something had been moved. I knelt down and pressed my gloved hand into the snow. The snow was soft, almost warm, like it had been packed recently. I felt a strange, unsettling sensation, like the snow was not snow at all. Like it was covering something. Something that had been left behind. Something that had been buried. I stood up slowly, my mind racing. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know where to go. The storm was all around me. The forest was a wall of white. I thought about the names on the wall, the dates, the warnings, the way the cabin had been waiting for me. And then I thought of the word next. I thought of the way the cabin had called me, the way it had given me warmth, the way it had made me feel safe. And I realized something. The cabin had not been a refuge. It had been a lure. It had been a way to draw me in, to make me stay, to make me feel like I belonged. And now, with the cabin gone, I felt the true fear. The fear that I was not just lost in the storm. The fear that I was lost in something that didn't follow normal rules. The fear that the cabin had been real enough to trap me. The fear that the cabin had been a part of the storm. The fear that the cabin had been a part of me. I looked at the footprints again. They led to nothing. But I had been there. I had been inside. I had seen the names. I had seen my name. I had seen the warning. I had heard the shadows move. I had felt the warmth that wasn't real. And now the cabin was gone. I started walking, following the footprints, trying to find the trail again. My boots sank into the snow. The cold bit at my face. The wind tried to push me back. I walked for what felt like hours. The storm did not let up. The forest did not change. The world remained a blur of white. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. Not in a way I could see, but in a way I could feel. Like a presence just behind me. Like a shadow in the snow. Like the cabin's warmth lingering on my skin. I kept walking because I didn't know what else to do. Because staying still felt like letting the storm take me. Because the idea of going back to the place where the cabin had been felt impossible. Like the cabin had never existed. Like the cabin had been a dream. But I knew it wasn't a dream. I knew what I had seen. I knew what I had touched. I knew what was written on the wall. And I knew that somewhere in the storm, something was waiting for me. Something that had carved my name into the wood. Something that had written "You are next." And now, with the cabin vanished, I realized the worst part. The cabin didn't need to be there anymore. Because the cabin had already done its job. It had found me. It had marked me. It had chosen me. And now I was walking through the storm with the knowledge that I was not alone. That something was following me. And that it had my name. The first thing I noticed was the quiet. Not the quiet of a peaceful place, but the quiet of a place that had been waiting. When I drove up the narrow road to the cabin, the trees seemed to hold their breath. The air was still, the kind of still that makes you feel like you're standing underwater. Even the birds were silent. It was as if the forest had stopped moving just to watch me. I was there because of a complaint. A radio tower a few miles away had been acting up, and the signal had been breaking up in strange ways. My company had sent me out to check the lines, to see if something was causing interference. I had done this kind of work before. I'd climbed poles in storms. I'd crawled into attics. I'd fixed lines that had been chewed by animals. I'd dealt with weather with old equipment with bad connections. But I had never been somewhere like this. The cabin was old. It looked like it had been built in a hurry, then left to age alone. The wood was dark and weathered. The roof sagged slightly. The windows were covered in grime. There was a thin layer of dust on everything, like the cabin had been sealed shut for years. But it was not abandoned. I could tell because there was smoke in the air. Not fresh smoke, not the smell of a fire that had just been lit. Old smoke. The kind that clings to wood and never leaves. The cabin sat on the edge of a clearing. Behind it, the forest rose steeply. The trees were tall and thick, like they were protecting the cabin from the world. I stepped out of my truck and looked around. My breath came out in a cloud, even though it wasn't cold. The air felt heavy, like it was full of something invisible. I walked to the cabin and knocked on the door. No answer. I knocked again, louder. Still nothing. I tried the handle. The door opened. The cabin was dark inside, but it was warm. The air smelled like old wood and smoke and something faintly sweet, like burning sugar. It was the kind of smell that makes you think of a kitchen, even when you're not in one. I pulled my flashlight out and stepped inside. The floor creaked under my boots. The walls were covered in old, faded wallpaper. There was a small table in the center of the room, and on it was a radio. Not a modern one. An old, bulky radio, the kind you see in old movies. The dial was cracked, the paint peeling. It was plugged in. I could see the cord running to a wall outlet. The outlet looked newer than the rest of the cabin, like it had been replaced recently. I walked closer to the radio and turned it on. The static filled the room. It was loud. It was thick. It was the kind of static that makes your ears hurt if you listen too long. But then, as I listened, the static began to change. It wasn't just noise. It sounded like voices. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks. The human brain does that. It tries to find patterns in random sounds. It tries to make sense of chaos. But this was different. The static had a rhythm, a pattern. It sounded like someone speaking, but the words were hidden inside the noise. It was like listening to someone talk from far away through a wall. I leaned closer to the radio, my hand on the dial. I turned it slowly, trying to find a clearer signal. The voices grew louder. Not clear, but louder. Like they were getting closer. I tried to adjust the antenna, but it didn't help. The static stayed the same. The voices stayed the same. I stood there, listening, feeling the hair on my arms rise. The voices sounded familiar. Not like someone I knew, but like something I had heard before. Like a memory. I reached out and touched the radio, and the static seemed to pulse. The voices grew stronger for a moment, and then they faded, like someone had turned a dial. I took a step back, my heart beating faster. The cabin felt different now. The air felt heavier. The warmth felt like it was pressing in on me. I looked around the room, trying to find something that made sense. A person, a sign, a note, anything. But there was nothing. Just the radio. Just the warmth. Just the silence. I turned the radio off, but the static didn't stop. It continued faintly, like the sound was coming from inside the walls. I reached for my phone and tried to get a signal, but there was nothing. No bars, no connection. The screen stayed dark. I felt a chill run down my spine. I walked toward the door and stepped outside again, trying to clear my head. The forest was quiet. The air was still. The clearing looked empty. I looked at the cabin, then at the trees, then at the sky. The sky was gray, like it was waiting to snow. The clouds hung low, heavy with moisture. The whole world felt like it was holding its breath. I took a deep breath and told myself to focus on the job. I was here to check the power lines, to find interference, to fix a problem. Not to worry about a creepy cabin. I walked to my truck and grabbed my tools. I put on my safety gear and headed toward the power line. The pole was a short distance from the cabin. I could see the line running from the cabin into the forest, disappearing into the trees. I followed it. The ground was soft, covered in pine needles. The air was thick with the smell of damp wood. The line was old, but it looked intact. I climbed the pole and began checking the connection. The wires were tight. The insulators were cracked. The line was old, but it wasn't damaged. I checked the signal, and it was strong. But the interference was still there. The static was still there. The voices were still there. I climbed down and walked back to the cabin. I needed to understand what was causing the noise. Maybe it was a faulty radio. Maybe it was a broken line. Maybe it was a hidden transmitter. I entered the cabin again, and the radio was still on. I hadn't turned it on. It was on. The static filled the room, and the voices were louder now. They sounded closer, like someone was speaking directly into the radio. I stood there frozen, listening. The voices were not speaking English, not clearly anyway. They were speaking in a way that sounded like words, but the words didn't form sentences. It sounded like someone trying to speak through a mouth that couldn't form words. I leaned in closer, trying to make out a pattern. And then I heard my name. Just once. It was not loud, it was not clear. But it was there. My name hidden inside the static. I stepped back, my heart pounding. I turned the radio off again, but the voices didn't stop. They kept whispering, like the radio was only a door, like the sound was coming from somewhere else. I looked around the cabin, feeling a sense of dread I couldn't explain. The walls seemed to be listening. The air seemed to be holding its breath. The radio seemed to be waiting. I realized then that the interference was not a technical problem. It was something else. Something that didn't belong to the world. Something that was using the radio as a way to speak. I felt a sudden sharp fear. because the voices sounded like they were trying to reach me. And the more I listened, the more I felt like they were getting closer. I stood there in the cabin, listening to the static, and I knew one thing. I was not alone. And whatever was speaking through the radio was not just interference. It was a message. And it was meant for me. The cabin was quiet again, but it was a quiet that felt full. Like the silence was waiting for something. I stood in the middle of the room, staring at the radio, my hands still trembling. The static had faded, but the sense of being watched hadn't. The air felt heavy, like the cabin was holding its breath. I told myself to stay calm. I told myself it was just a broken radio, just interference, just an old device acting up in an old building. But my mind kept going back to the voice that had said my name. I couldn't shake it. I walked to the table and picked up the radio again. The dial was still turned to the same station. The static was low now, like the radio was trying to sleep. I turned the volume knob up slowly and the static grew louder. I listened, waiting for the voice to return. And then it did. Not the voice that had said my name. A different voice. Older. Clearer. It sounded like a man speaking from a different era. The kind of voice you hear on old recordings. The kind of voice that has a crack in it, like it has been used for a long time. The voice began speaking in a calm, measured tone. I couldn't understand everything at first. The words were faint, like the voice was coming from far away. But as I listened, the voice became clearer. It was a broadcast. An old radio broadcast. The kind of broadcast you hear when you're tuning through stations, and you accidentally hit a frequency that hasn't been used in years. The voice spoke like a news announcer, but there was something strange about it, something that didn't belong. It was too calm, too steady, like the person speaking had already accepted what was happening. The voice said, "If you are hearing this, do not leave the cabin." I froze. The words hit me like a cold wave. My heart began to race. I looked around the room as if someone had spoken them out loud. The voice continued, "Do not leave. The storm will take you. The forest will take you. The cabin is the only place you are safe." I felt my mouth go dry. I tried to speak, but no sound came out. I stared at the radio, my mind trying to understand. The broadcast was old, the voice was old, the tone was old. But the warning was for me. It was as if the voice had been waiting for someone to hear it. The voice spoke again, and this time it sounded closer, like the broadcast had moved through the radio and into the room. "Listen carefully. The signal is weak. The interference is strong, but if you leave, you will not return." I sat down slowly, my knees weak. I felt like I was sinking into the chair. The cabin felt like it was closing in. The voice continued, and the words felt like they were being spoken directly to me. "There are things in the forest, things that are not animals, things that do not follow the rules of the world. They are drawn to movement, they are drawn to sound, they are drawn to fear." I swallowed hard. The words felt like a knife. The voice went on. "They will follow you, they will watch you, they will wait. They will not need to hunt you, you will bring yourself to them." I stared at the radio, my hands shaking. The voice was calm, but the message was terrifying. The broadcast sounded like it had been recorded long ago, but the warning was meant for me now. It didn't make sense. It shouldn't make sense. But the voice sounded so certain. Like the person speaking had already seen what would happen. Like the person speaking had already been there. The voice continued, "If you leave, you will be lost. The cabin is a door. The cabin is a shield. The cabin is a trap, but it is the only trap that keeps you alive." The words hit me hard. I felt my chest tighten. I felt a cold sweat on my skin. The voice spoke again, and this time it sounded almost sad. "Do not try to fight it. Do not try to outsmart it. The forest is older than you. The storm is older than you. The cabin is older than you. I looked around the room, feeling like the walls were listening. The shadows in the corners seemed to lean closer, like they were waiting for the broadcast to end. The voice continued, and the words became more urgent. If you are hearing this, it means the cabin has found you. It means you have been chosen. It means you are not alone. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. I felt like I was drowning in the words. The voice spoke again, and I could hear a faint crackle in the broadcast, like the signal was breaking. Do not leave. Do not step into the storm. Do not follow the footprints. Do not trust the path. The forest will change. The forest will lie. The forest will lead you to the edge. I stared at the radio, my mind racing. The words felt like a warning from someone who had already been lost, someone who had already tried to leave, someone who had failed. The voice continued, and the broadcast seemed to grow quieter, as if the signal was fading. Stay inside, stay close to the fire, keep the radio on, keep listening. If you hear your name, do not answer. If you hear a voice in the static, do not respond. I felt my hands tighten around the edge of the table. My knuckles turned white. The voice spoke one last time, and the words were so quiet I had to strain to hear them. Remember, the cabin is not a place. It is a choice. You can leave the cabin, but you cannot leave the story. The broadcast ended. The static returned, thick and loud. The voices in the static seemed to rise again, like they had been waiting for the broadcast to finish. I sat there, staring at the radio, trying to understand what I had just heard. The warning had been clear. Do not leave the cabin. But I had come here to fix a problem. I had come here to check the lines. I had come here to do my job. And now I was being told that leaving would kill me. I looked around the cabin, feeling trapped. The walls felt closer. The air felt heavier. The warmth felt like it was pressing against my skin. I thought about the storm outside, the way the trees had been silent, the way the forest had seemed to watch me. I thought about the radio and the voice that had warned me. I thought about the way the cabin had felt like it had been waiting for me. And I realized something. The cabin wasn't just a place. It was a story that had been told before. A story that had a beginning, a middle, and an ending. And I was now part of it. I stood up slowly, my legs shaking. I walked to the window and looked outside. The storm was still raging. The trees still stood silent. I looked back at the radio, and I felt a strange sense of dread. Not because of the storm, not because of the forest, but because of the cabin itself. Because the cabin had a voice. Because the cabin had a warning. Because the cabin had a story. And I was now inside it. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was scared in the way people usually mean when they say scared. It wasn't the kind of fear that makes you jump at shadows or flinch at a creak. It was deeper than that. It was the kind of fear that makes you feel like you're already inside something you can't leave. The radio sat on the table, still humming with static. The broadcast had stopped, but the silence it left behind was heavy. I kept turning the radio dial, half expecting the voice to come back, half hoping it wouldn't. I stared at the walls for a long time. I stared at the corners. I stared at the floorboards. I listened to the wind outside, and I kept thinking about what the voice had said. The cabin is not a place, it is a choice. I didn't know what that meant, but I felt it in my bones. The storm was still raging, but I could hear something else now. A faint hum like electricity moving through metal. It wasn't the radio. It wasn't the fire, it was something else. I got up and walked to the wall where the power line entered the cabin. The cable ran through a small opening in the wood, and I followed it with my eyes, trying to find where it went. The wire looked normal at first, thick, insulated, old, but as I stared, I noticed something strange. The wire didn't just go through the wall. It went through the floor. Not through a junction box, not through a hole that had been cut for it. It went straight down, like it had been laid there on purpose, like it was being fed into the cabin from below. My skin went cold. I crouched down and put my hand on the floor. The wood was warm, but the warmth felt wrong. It felt like it was being heated from underneath. I pushed my fingers against the floorboards and felt the slight vibration. It was subtle, but it was there. Like a heartbeat. Like something alive. I stood up slowly, my mind racing. The storm outside sounded distant now. The cabin felt like it was breathing. I walked to the corner of the room where the floorboards looked older. The wood was darker there, as if it had been stained by something. I ran my hand over it and felt a faint depression, like a seam. I knelt down and pressed my fingers into the seam. The wood gave slightly, and I realized it wasn't just a seam. It was a door, a hidden hatch. My heart pounded in my chest. I felt my breath quicken. I thought about the voice on the radio, the warning, the way it had sounded like it had been waiting for me. I pulled on the hatch. It opened with a slow creak, and cold air rushed up from below. The air smelled like damp earth, like old metal, like something that had been buried for a long time. I shone my flashlight down into the darkness. The beam cut through the black, revealing a narrow staircase that led down into the ground. The stairs looked old. The wood was worn. The nails were rusted, but the smell was fresh, like the space below had been used recently. I hesitated. I thought about the warning. I thought about the storm. I thought about the forest outside. And then I thought about my job. I was a repairman. I had come here to fix a problem. I had come here to check the lines. I had come here to do what I was trained to do. And now I was staring at a hidden basement that didn't belong in any cabin I had ever seen. I took a deep breath and started down the stairs. The air grew colder as I descended. My flashlight beam shook slightly in my hand. The stairs creaked under my weight, and I felt like every sound was being amplified by the darkness. At the bottom of the stairs, the space opened up into a room that was bigger than I expected. The walls were made of concrete, not wood. The floor was dirt, but it was packed hard like it had been walked on many times. The room was lit by a faint, unnatural glow, not from a light bulb, not from a lantern. The glow seemed to come from the walls themselves, like the concrete was radiating light. I stood still, my flashlight trembling. There were devices scattered around the room, old equipment, strange machinery, wires running in every direction like veins. Some of the devices looked like they had been made in a factory. Others looked homemade, like someone had built them with whatever they could find. There were meters and dials, switches and knobs. There were coils of wire that looked like they had been wrapped by hand. There were glass tubes that glowed faintly, like they were filled with something alive. The air felt charged, like a storm trapped underground. I walked slowly through the room, my eyes scanning everything. I tried to make sense of it. I tried to find a pattern. I tried to find something that would explain why this basement existed. And then I saw the wire. It ran from the cabin above through the floor and into a large device in the center of the room. The device was shaped like a box, but it was covered in wires. It had a metal plate on the front with a small window. Inside the window, I could see a faint glow, like a heartbeat. I walked closer, my breath shallow. I looked at the device and noticed a label on the side. It was handwritten, in shaky letters. It said, "Signal receiver." I felt a chill run down my spine. The words didn't make sense. A receiver for what? I looked around the room again, and I noticed something else. There were photographs pinned to the wall, not old, faded photographs, new ones. The paper looked fresh. The images were clear. I walked over and stared at them. They were pictures of the cabin. but not the cabin from the outside. Pictures of the cabin from the inside. Pictures of the rooms, pictures of the walls, pictures of the floorboards, pictures of the radio. And in each photograph there was a figure, a shadow, a dark shape standing in the corner. In some photos the figure was closer, in others it was farther away, but it was always there. Watching, I felt my stomach twist. I looked at the photos more carefully and realized something else. The figure in the corner wasn't just a shadow. It had a shape, a human shape, but the face was always blurred, like the camera couldn't focus on it, like the camera didn't want to show it. I stepped back, my heart racing. The room felt like it was closing in. The glow from the devices seemed to brighten, as if something had noticed me. I turned my flashlight toward the far wall and saw another set of photographs. These were different. These were pictures of the forest. Not the trees, not the snow, not the storm. Pictures of footprints. Footprints that led into the trees. Footprints that stopped abruptly, as if the person had vanished. I felt a cold sweat on my skin. I could feel the hairs on my arms standing up. I walked to the center of the room and stared at the device again. The wire from the cabin ran into it, and more wires ran out, disappearing into the walls. I followed one of the wires with my eyes. It led to a small panel on the wall. The panel had a dial and a switch. The dial was set to a number that looked like it had been adjusted many times. I looked at the switch. It was labeled Transmit. I felt my throat tighten. I realized something. The cabin wasn't just connected to the power line. It was connected to something else. Something underground. Something that was using the cabin. Something that was using the radio. Something that was listening. And possibly something that was speaking. I stepped back from the panel, my mind racing. The voice on the radio. The warning. The cabin being a choice. The cabin wasn't just a place to hide from the storm. It was a hub, a node, a station, and I had just found the heart of it. The air in the basement felt colder now. The glow from the devices pulsed faintly, like a slow breath. I felt a sense of dread I couldn't explain. Not because of what I had seen, but because of what I hadn't. Because I could feel the presence of something in the room with me. Something that wasn't in the photographs. Something that wasn't in the cabin above. Something that was here, underground, listening to me. I stood still, my flashlight beam shaking, and I listened. At first, I heard only the hum of the devices. Then faintly, I heard something else. A sound like a whisper. Like the radio static had become a voice again, but this time it was coming from the walls. I strained to listen, and I could make out a word. Just one. A single word, repeated over and over. Stay. The word echoed in the room, soft and low. Not loud enough to be heard above the storm. Not loud enough to be heard above my own thoughts, but loud enough to make my blood run cold. I realized then that the voice on the radio hadn't been warning me. It had been instructing me. It had been guiding me. And now it was telling me to stay. I took a step back, my heart pounding. I felt the urge to run up the stairs, to get out of the basement, to escape the glow and the wires and the strange devices. But I didn't move. I couldn't. It was like the room had a hold on me. Like the wire running through the cabin was not just a wire. It was a leash. And I was the animal. The basement felt like it was alive. Like it was waiting for me to decide. To choose. To stay. Or to leave. And I realized with a cold certainty that the cabin had been waiting for me all along. Not just for shelter, but for something else. Something underground. Something that had been listening. Something that had been speaking. Something that wanted me to stay. The first call came just after midnight, when the storm had finally quieted enough for me to hear the wind again. The cabin was silent in that way that makes you feel like you're not alone, even when you're the only person in the room. My phone lit up on the table, and the screen showed a number I didn't recognize. No name. Just a string of digits that looked like they belonged to an old phone line. I picked it up without thinking. "Hello," I said, my voice too loud in the quiet. On the other end there was static, then a faint sound, a voice muffled like it was speaking through water. I listened, my heart beating in my throat. Then the voice spoke again, clearer. "Can you hear me?" The words were familiar. Not because I knew the person speaking, but because I had heard that exact tone before. On the radio, the voice was the same. It was the voice that had warned me not to leave. It was the voice that had told me the cabin was a choice. It was the voice that had said, "Stay." My hand went cold. I held the phone closer, and the voice came through again. "Please," it said, "please, I'm still here." I swallowed. "Who is this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. There was a pause. Then the voice said something that made my stomach drop. "It's me," the voice whispered. "It's me, I'm still here, I can't get out." I felt the room tilt. I looked around, as if someone might be standing in the corner watching me. But there was only the cabin. Only the fire. Only the radio, silent on the table. I stared at the phone, my mind racing. "Who are you?" I asked again, but my voice was weaker now. The voice on the phone didn't answer right away. It sounded like it was struggling, like it was fighting against something. Then it said softly, "You're the repairman." I froze. I had said that word out loud earlier, when I was trying to convince myself I wasn't lost. I had said it like a fact, like a label, like a role. The voice on the phone said it back like it knew me, like it had been waiting for me to say it. My throat tightened. I tried to remember if I had shared my job with anyone, if I had told someone in town that I was coming here, if I had told my wife. I had told no one. No one except the voice. And now the voice was calling me by the only thing it knew about me. "You're the repairman," it repeated. "You fix things, you make them work again." My hands shook. I looked at the radio. The static had stopped. The silence was heavy, like the cabin itself was listening. "Where are you?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The voice hesitated. Then it said, "Down." I felt my blood go cold. I remembered the basement, the hidden room, the device, the wire, the glow, the photographs. I remembered the way the air had felt like it was alive. I remembered the way the voice had told me to stay. I remembered the way the word "stay" had echoed in the darkness. "Down where?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. There was a long pause. Then the voice said, "In the walls, in the wires, in the signal, in the place you can't see." My skin prickled. The cabin felt like it was breathing again. I looked at the phone screen. The call was still active. The digits were still there. I could hear the faint hiss of static beneath the voice. I could hear the sound of something moving, something shifting, something trying to get closer. I swallowed hard and asked, "How long have you been there?" The voice answered immediately, like it had been waiting for the question. "Since the first time the signal came on," it said. "Since the first time someone listened." I felt a wave of nausea. I had come here to fix interference. I had come here because the local residents complained the line kept cutting out. I had come here because I thought it was a simple job. A broken wire, a loose connection, something I could fix in an hour or two. But now I realized I had walked into something that had been going on for years. Something that had been happening long before I arrived. Something that had been waiting for someone to listen. The voice continued, "I can hear you. I can hear your heart. I can hear your breath. I can hear you breathing in the cabin. I can hear you moving. I can hear you thinking." I felt my hands tighten around the phone. "I'm not thinking," I said, but my voice sounded like a lie. The voice said, "Yes, you are. You're thinking about leaving. You're thinking about going back to your life. You're thinking about the people you love." My throat tightened. My wife's face flashed in my mind. Her smile, her voice, the way she always made me feel like I was safe. I hadn't told her where I was going. I hadn't told her I was going to a cabin in the woods. I hadn't told her about the storm. I hadn't told her about the basement. And now I realized I might never be able to tell her the truth. The voice said softly, "You can leave." I swallowed hard. My heart pounded. "You can leave," the voice repeated, "but you won't, not yet." I felt a chill run through me. "How do you know?" I asked. The voice laughed, but it wasn't a real laugh. It sounded like the sound of a radio turning on. "You're listening," the voice said. "You're still listening. You came here to fix a problem, but the problem is you. You're the one who answers the call." My breath caught. I stared at the phone, my mind racing. The voice was right. I had answered. I had picked up. I had listened. And now I couldn't stop. I tried to end the call. I pressed the button. The screen went black. The call ended. But the voice didn't stop. It continued in my mind, like the signal had seeped into my thoughts. "Don't leave," it whispered. I felt my skin go cold. I looked around the cabin. The fire was still burning, but the flames looked dull, like they were being watched. The walls seemed closer. The corners seemed darker. The cabin felt smaller. The air felt heavier. I sat down slowly, my back against the wall, and tried to calm my breathing. I tried to convince myself it was just a prank, a glitch, a trick of the storm. But the voice had said things no one could know. It had said things that made me feel like I was being watched from inside the walls. It had said things that made me feel like the cabin was alive. And I realized something else. The call hadn't come from the outside world. It had come from inside the cabin. From the signal. From the wire. From the device in the basement. From the place where the cabin's past was trapped. From the place where something had been waiting for someone to listen. I looked at the radio again, and for the first time, I noticed something I had missed before. There was a small red light on the front panel. A tiny dot that glowed faintly, like a heartbeat. The radio was still on, even though I had turned it off. Even though the static had stopped. The radio was on, quietly broadcasting. And I knew then that the cabin was still sending out a signal. Not to the world, but to anyone who might come here. Anyone who might answer. Anyone who might listen. Anyone who might become the next voice trapped inside. I sat there for a long time, listening to the storm outside and the faint hum of the radio. I kept thinking about the voice on the phone. The way it had said, "I'm still here." The way it had said, "I can't get out." The way it had said, "You're the repairman." I realized then that the cabin wasn't just broadcasting a signal. It was broadcasting a presence. A trapped presence. A voice that had been waiting for someone to hear it. And now it had found me. I didn't know how long I sat there. I didn't know how many times my phone rang again. I didn't know how many calls I answered. But every time I answered, the voice was there. Always the same. Always whispering. Always saying the same thing. Stay. I first saw the case file on a rainy Thursday. The kind of day when the world feels washed clean but still somehow heavy. The office was quiet, the fluorescent lights humming in a way that made me feel like I was underwater. I was sorting through old stories, trying to find something that still had a pulse, something that could pull me out of the routine. That's when I found it. A thin folder, yellowed at the edges, tucked away behind a stack of newer cases. The label on the front was simple, clean, like whoever had written it didn't want to draw attention. Missing Harrison Lane. The file was dated nearly 10 years ago. A missing person case. Cold, unsolved. And it had that quiet kind of wrongness that made you want to keep looking, even if you knew it would change you. I opened it carefully as if the paper might tear. Inside were the usual things: police reports, witness statements, photographs, a few notes written in the margins. But there was something else too. A sense of unfinished sentences. A feeling that someone had left the story halfway through and walked away, hoping it would stay hidden. Harrison Lane was 27 when he disappeared. He was last seen near a cabin in the woods, a place the locals called the Old Ridge Cabin. The report said he was driving to a remote hunting spot, then his phone went dead. No one saw him again. The cabin was listed as abandoned, not on any maps, not on any official records. Just a rumor, just a name, just a story people told when they wanted to scare each other. But what caught my attention was the detail in the report that seemed almost casual. Witness reports hearing a voice coming from the woods. Voice sounded like a radio transmission. I read that line twice. Then again. A voice like a radio transmission. It sounded like something a person would write when they didn't want to admit they were afraid, like a way to keep the story from becoming real. But it was real enough to be written down. I flipped through the pages, searching for anything else that might explain it. There were the usual theories. Harrison had run off. Harrison had met with an accident. Harrison had been taken by someone. But none of those theories had proof. No body. No evidence. No sign of struggle. Just a trail that ended at the edge of the woods, where the trees grew thick and the air seemed to change. The case file had one photograph of Harrison. He was smiling, standing by his truck, his hair messy from wind, his eyes bright. A normal picture of a normal man. The kind of photo that makes you feel like you knew him, even if you didn't. I stared at his face for a long time. I tried to imagine what it would be like to vanish without a trace, to be walking through the woods and then simply not exist anymore, to become a story that other people would tell, a name on a file, a line in a report. I turned the page. There was a map, a hand-drawn map, the kind someone might sketch in a hurry. It showed the road leading to the cabin, then a narrow path into the trees. The cabin was marked with a small X. Beside it, a note in handwriting that looked like it had been written in a rush. Don't go, the cabin isn't empty. The note was unsigned. No name, no date, just those words. Don't go. The file had a few more pages, but the handwriting got messier. The ink was smudged in places like the writer had been shaking. There were scribbles in the margins, words crossed out, then written again. One page had a list of things Harrison had supposedly said before he disappeared. I heard something in the walls. The cabin is calling. The radio is talking to me. I felt a chill move through me. It was one thing to read about a missing person. It was another to read the words of someone who had been scared and still had time to write them down. The file ended abruptly. No final report. No closure. Just a blank space where the rest of the story should have been. I sat back in my chair and felt the weight of it. I had written stories like this before. I had written about murders, about accidents, about the way people disappear and the way the world moves on. I had always thought that the worst part was the unknown. But now I realized the worst part might be the fact that someone had been trying to tell the truth and no one had listened. I closed the folder slowly, like I was closing a door. But I didn't feel like I was done. I felt like the door had been opened and something was waiting on the other side. The next day, I drove out to the edge of town, to the place where the road turned into a dirt path. The rain had stopped, but the sky was still heavy with clouds. The trees along the road looked like they were holding their breath. I had my notebook, my camera, and a small recorder. I told myself I was going to do what I always did: gather facts, talk to people, look for evidence. I told myself I was doing this for the story. But the truth was, I wanted to know what happened to Harrison Lane. I wanted to know why his name had been left on a file for 10 years, like a mark on a wall. I wanted to know what was so strange about the cabin that it made people write notes like, "Don't go." I followed the map from the file, trying to keep my eyes on the path while also watching for anything that looked out of place. The road narrowed, the trees grew thicker, the air got colder even though it was still summer. I could feel the change in my body before I saw it, like the woods were pressing in. And then I saw it. The cabin. It was small, made of old wood that looked like it had been there for a long time. The roof sagged slightly and the windows were dark, not broken, just dark, like they were reflecting nothing. It was not the kind of cabin you would expect to find on a map. It was the kind of cabin you would expect to find in a story. I parked my car a short distance away and walked closer. The air around the cabin felt different. The sound of the forest seemed to fade. Even the birds were quiet. I stood at the edge of the clearing and looked at the cabin. It felt like the cabin was looking back. My heart started to beat faster. I told myself it was just nerves, just the thrill of a story, just the rush of being somewhere no one else had been. But the feeling didn't go away. It stayed with me, like a shadow in the corner of my mind. I stepped closer. The ground was soft beneath my feet. The smell of wet wood and old smoke drifted through the air. It was a smell that didn't belong to a place that had been abandoned for years. It was the smell of someone leaving, and then leaving again. I reached the cabin door. It was closed, but not locked. The wood was cold under my hand. I pushed the door open slowly. The air inside was still. The cabin was empty, or at least it looked empty. There was a small table in the center of the room, a chair pushed slightly back, a fireplace with old ashes, a dusty radio on the shelf. The radio was off, but the silence around it felt like it was waiting to be broken. I stepped inside, my shoes making soft sounds on the floorboards. I looked around. The cabin felt like it was holding its breath. I had a strange sensation, like I was not supposed to be there, like I had crossed a line. And then I noticed something on the floor. A set of footprints. Not fresh, not old, just there, leading from the door to the center of the room, leading to the table, leading to the radio, as if someone had been sitting there recently. As if someone had been listening. As if someone had been waiting for me. I stood still, my breath shallow. I realized, with a sudden, quiet dread, that I was not the first person to come here. And I wasn't the first person to hear the call. I looked at the radio again. And I wondered, for the first time, what it meant when a place kept sending out a signal. I wondered what it meant when a cabin was not empty. I wondered what it meant when a missing person case was not a case at all, but a warning. I stood there in the silence, and I realized that the story I had come to investigate was not just a story. It was a door, and I had just stepped inside. I didn't go back to my car right away. The cabin had a way of making the air feel thick, like every breath was being measured. I stayed inside, slowly moving through the room as if the act of walking might wake something. The radio sat on the shelf like a quiet animal, and I couldn't stop looking at it. The footprints on the floor led right to it, and I had the sudden, strange feeling that the cabin was showing me something. Like it wanted me to find it. I turned my head toward the corner where the fireplace was. The ashes were old, but there was a faint smell of smoke, as if someone had built a fire not long ago. Not hours, not days. Maybe weeks. Maybe months. But the smell was too fresh for a place that was supposed to be abandoned. I moved toward the fireplace and saw something tucked behind the old log rack. A small plastic case. The kind you use for storing tapes. My hands went cold. I didn't know why I was surprised. I had seen enough old cases in police files to know what they meant. I had handled enough evidence to know what kind of things people kept. But I hadn't expected to find one here, in a cabin that was not on any map. I picked up the case and opened it. Inside was a cassette tape. The label was handwritten, in a neat, careful script. Police interview Harrison Lane. I stared at it for a long time. Then I turned the tape over. There was another note on the back, written in the same handwriting. Do not play. The words looked like a warning. But I had already opened the case. I had already held the tape. And something in me wanted to hear it. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the feeling that I was being watched. Maybe it was the part of me that always wants to know the truth, even if the truth hurts. I took the tape out and held it in my hand. The plastic felt cold. The label looked old, like it had been there for years. I walked to the table and set the tape down beside the radio. My recorder was still in my bag, and I reached for it without thinking. I had a small portable cassette player in my bag too, the kind I used for old interviews. I didn't know why I had it with me. Maybe because I like to be prepared. Maybe because I'm a little obsessive. Maybe because I had a feeling I might need it. I set the player on the table, plugged in the headphones, and slid the tape in. The cassette clicked into place. I pressed play. The sound that came out was faint at first, then stronger. A man's voice. A police officer. The tone was calm, professional. But there was an edge to it, like the officer was trying to keep his voice steady. Interview recorded on June 12th, the officer said. Subject, Harrison Lane, missing person. Last seen near Old Ridge Cabin. Begin interview. I leaned closer. My heart began to beat faster. The voice on the tape was Harrison's. His voice was thin, tired, like he had been awake too long. I felt a strange shock when I heard it. It was like hearing someone you thought you knew. Harrison, the officer said, can you tell me what happened that night? Harrison's voice came through, quiet, almost whispering. I don't know, he said. I was just driving. I was going to the cabin. I was going to check the lines. I thought it would be simple. The officer's voice was calm. Did you see anyone? Harrison hesitated. Then he said, no, I didn't see anyone, but I heard something like a voice, like a radio. I felt my skin go cold. The tape continued. I thought it was my phone, Harrison said, but my phone was dead. I thought it was the radio, but the radio wasn't on. It was like the voice was in the air. The officer's voice softened. Harrison, are you sure you're okay? There was a pause. Then Harrison said, I think I'm fine. I don't like it here. The officer said, can you tell me why? Harrison's voice grew quieter. The cabin is not empty, he said. It's not empty at all. There's something in the walls. Something in the wires. It's like the cabin is listening. I swallowed hard. The room felt colder. The air felt thicker. The tape continued. The officer asked, what do you mean the cabin is listening? Harrison's voice came through again, and I could hear the fear in it now. "It's like it knows I'm here," he said. "Like it knows what I'm thinking. Like it knows what I'm going to do." The officer's voice sounded a little more tense. "Harrison, did you tell anyone else about this?" Harrison paused. Then he said, "No, I didn't want to sound crazy." The officer said, "Harrison, can you tell me where you are now?" Harrison's voice was almost a whisper. "I'm at the cabin," he said. "I'm at the cabin and I don't think I'm alone." The tape crackled. The sound of static filled the room. I felt my breath catch. Then the voice on the tape changed. It was Harrison's voice anymore. It was something else. Something that sounded like it was coming through a broken speaker. A voice that was not quite human. It spoke in a slow, calm tone, like it was speaking to someone who was listening carefully. "Don't leave," the voice said. I froze. My hands went numb. The voice continued, "Stay, stay, stay." I looked around the cabin, my heart pounding. The radio was silent. The tape was still playing. But the voice sounded like it was coming from everywhere. It sounded like it was in the walls. It sounded like it was in the air. It sounded like it was in the signal itself. I pulled the headphones off and stared at the tape player. My hands shook. I pressed pause. The tape stopped. The room was silent again. But I could still feel the presence of the voice. Like it was lingering in the air. Like it had left a mark. I looked at the tape and realized something. The tape wasn't just a recording. It was a message. And the message was not meant for me. It was meant for anyone who listened. The voice on the tape had spoken directly to me. It had said, "Don't leave." It had said, "Stay." It had said, "You're listening." And I realized then that the cabin wasn't just a place. It was a trap. A place that waited for people to come in and listen. A place that used their curiosity against them. A place that fed on attention. I stood there for a long time, staring at the tape. My mind was racing, but my body felt heavy, like I was stuck in mud. I thought about Harrison. I thought about the missing file. I thought about the notes that said, "Don't go." I thought about the way the cabin felt like it was watching me. And I realized something else. The voice on the tape wasn't responding to me by accident. It was responding because it knew I was there. Because it knew I was listening. Because it knew I had come to the cabin. Because it knew I was the next one. I took the tape out of the player and held it in my hand again. The plastic felt cold, like it had been in the cabin for years. I looked at the label. Police interview Harrison Lane. And I understood, with a quiet dread, that Harrison's voice had been recorded after he disappeared. That the interview had been conducted after the case was already cold. That the police had been listening to the cabin too. And that the cabin had been listening back. I set the tape back in its case. I closed the case. And I felt the cabin's silence press in around me. Like the walls were waiting. Like the radio was waiting. Like the signal was waiting. And I knew without a doubt that the cabin was still broadcasting. And it was still hungry for someone to answer. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. I stayed in the cabin because I didn't know where else to go, and because I felt like the cabin was holding me there, like it was a hand on my shoulder. The fire in the fireplace had died down, leaving behind a faint warmth that didn't feel natural. It was more like a memory of warmth, the kind you feel in your bones when you remember being safe, but you're not safe anymore. I kept the tape in its case on the table, like a warning. Like a piece of evidence that proved I wasn't imagining things. The cabin was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're not allowed to make noise. I sat in the chair and stared at the radio, half expecting it to turn on by itself. half expecting the voice to come back. But nothing happened. Just silence. I told myself to rest. I told myself to keep my mind calm. I told myself I was a journalist. I told myself I had a job to do. So I stood up and started looking around the cabin again. I walked slowly, listening to my footsteps on the floorboards. The cabin felt like a maze. Every corner felt familiar, like I had been there before. Like the cabin was shaped to make you feel like you belonged there. I checked the kitchen. Old dishes. A broken cup. A table set for one. The food in the cabinet was old, but not rotten. It looked like it had been placed there and then forgotten. There was a smell of dust and old bread. A smell of someone who had been living there. I moved to the bedroom. The bed was made neatly. The sheets were old, but they were clean, like someone had taken care to keep the room tidy. On the nightstand was a lamp turned off. On the lamp was a small notebook. I picked it up. It was a diary. The cover was worn, and the pages were yellowed. The first page had a name written on it. Harrison Lane. I felt my breath catch. I had expected the diary to belong to someone else. But it was his. It was his handwriting. It was his name. I sat down on the bed and opened the diary slowly. The first entry was dated the day before he disappeared. The handwriting was neat, like he had been trying to stay calm. But the words were shaky. The entry read, "I came to the cabin to fix the line. I thought it would be easy. I thought it would be like any other job, but the air feels wrong. The woods feel wrong. The cabin feels wrong. I keep hearing things." I read the next entry. The handwriting was more rushed now. "The radio is on. I didn't turn it on. The sound is low like it's far away, but I can hear a voice. It's telling me things. It's telling me to stay. It's telling me to listen." My hands shook. I kept reading. The diary was full of fear. Not the kind of fear you feel when you're in danger. The kind of fear you feel when you realize you're not alone, and you don't know what you're dealing with. The entries continued. "I tried to leave. The road is gone. The trees are too thick. The path is not there. It's like the woods moved, like the cabin moved, like everything moved. I heard something in the walls. It sounded like whispering. It sounded like someone talking to me. It sounded like the cabin was speaking. I don't know how long I've been here. I don't know what day it is. The radio keeps saying the same thing. Stay, stay, stay." I felt my stomach twist. The diary was like a timeline of his descent, like a record of someone slowly losing their mind, or slowly realizing something that was impossible to understand. I kept reading. There was an entry that made my skin go cold. I found a room behind the wall, a hidden room. It has photographs. It has notes. It has a chair. It has a radio. It has a door that leads to the basement. I don't know who built it. I don't know who lives there. I don't know if anyone is alive. I stared at the page. A hidden room. A room that wasn't meant to be found. A room that was meant to be hidden. I thought about the basement I had found earlier. The strange devices. The wires. The feeling of being watched. I realized then that the cabin was not just a place. It was a machine. A place built to trap people. To keep them there. To keep them listening. I read on. The next entry was written in a shaky hand, like he was holding the pen with trembling fingers. "I don't want to be here anymore. I want to go home. I want to see my wife. I want to see my daughter. I want to see my life. But the cabin won't let me leave. The cabin is in the walls. The cabin is in the wires. The cabin is in the signal." I felt tears in my eyes. I didn't know why. I didn't even know Harrison. But reading his words made me feel like I was inside his mind. Like I was feeling his fear. like I was feeling his hopelessness. I kept reading. The next entry was short, just a few lines. I heard my name. I heard it in the radio. I heard it in the walls. I heard it in the wind. It said my name like it knew me, like it had been waiting for me. I looked up from the diary. The cabin felt darker now. The shadows seemed deeper. The air seemed colder. I stood up slowly and looked around the room. The bed, the nightstand, the lamp, the walls. I felt like the room was watching me. I realized then that the diary was not just a record of Harrison's fear. It was a warning that the cabin was still active, that the cabin was still listening, that the cabin was still calling. I closed the diary carefully and placed it back on the nightstand. I felt a strange urge to leave, to run, to get out of the cabin. But I also felt the pull of the story, the pull of the mystery, the pull of the need to know what happened to Harrison. I sat back down on the bed. My hands were shaking. I stared at the diary. I thought about the voice on the tape. I thought about the message that had been recorded after he disappeared. I thought about the cabin signal, and I realized something that made my heart drop. The diary had been left untouched. The room had been left untouched. Like someone had been waiting for me to find it. Like someone had been waiting for me to read it. Like someone had been waiting for me to become the next person to listen. I looked at the walls. I listened. The cabin was quiet, but I could feel the silence. The silence felt like a presence, like something waiting, like something patient. And I knew then that the cabin wasn't just a place where people disappeared. It was a place where people were kept, a place where people were trapped, a place where the signal was the cage, a place where the voice was the jailer. I stayed in the room for a long time, holding the diary like it was a lifeline. And I kept thinking about the last line I had read, the one that made my blood run cold, the one that made the room feel like it was closing in. It said my name like it knew me, because I realized then that the cabin might already know mine too. I didn't realize it at first. I thought the cabin was just a place where someone had disappeared, a place that held a story. I thought I was the one telling the story. I thought I was the journalist. I thought I was the observer. But the cabin doesn't let you stay outside the story. It pulls you in. It makes you part of it. I was sitting on the bed, staring at the diary when I noticed something. The words weren't just written. They were arranged. Like the diary was guiding me. Like it was leading me through a path that wasn't meant to end. I looked around the room again. The walls, the ceiling, the shadows, everything felt too still, too perfect, like the cabin was holding its breath. And then I heard it, a faint sound, not a voice, not a whisper, more like the sound of paper turning. Slowly, as if someone was reading. I stood up. My heart was pounding. I told myself it was just the wind. I told myself it was the house settling. But I knew it was. I walked to the door. I tried the handle. It was locked. Not the kind of lock you can break. The kind of lock that makes you feel like you were never meant to leave. I pressed my ear against the door. I listened. There was silence on the other side. But the silence felt like something was waiting. Like something was listening to me. I stepped back into the room. I looked at the diary again. The last page was open. I hadn't left it open. I had closed it. But now it was open again. As if someone had turned the page. As if someone wanted me to read what was next. I picked up the diary slowly. My hands were shaking. I looked at the last line. The last line I had read. The one that said, it said my name like it knew me. And below it, in a different handwriting, there was another line. A line that wasn't there before. A line that looked like it had been written recently. It said, "You're not alone." My mouth went dry. I felt a chill run down my spine. I put the diary down. I backed away. I felt like the room was closing in. Like the walls were getting closer. I looked at the window. Outside, the woods were dark. The trees were black silhouettes. The snow was still falling. The world outside looked normal. But the cabin didn't feel normal anymore. It felt like a trap. It felt like a mouth that was closing. I sat back on the bed. I tried to calm myself. I told myself I was tired. I told myself I was stressed. I told myself the diary was playing tricks on me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That something was watching me. I stared at the radio. The radio was off. But I could feel the signal. Like a pressure in my head. Like a hum behind my eyes. I picked up my phone. The screen was black. No signal. No bars. No service. I felt a wave of panic. I tried to call out. I tried to call anyone. But my voice felt trapped in my throat. It felt like the cabin was swallowing my words. I sat there holding my phone, and I realized something that made my stomach drop. The cabin wasn't just trapping me physically. It was trapping me in the story. It was trapping me in the same loop. The same timeline. The same path that Harrison had walked. I was becoming the story. The diary wasn't a record of what happened. It was a guide, a map, a script, and I was following it. I looked at the diary again. I flipped through the pages. The entries were still there. But now I noticed something new. Some of the words were different. Not in meaning, but in tone, in rhythm, in the way they were written. It was like the diary was changing as I read it. Like it was adjusting to me. Like it was writing itself around my thoughts. I felt my mind go numb. I tried to stand up, but my legs felt heavy, like I was sinking into the floor. I looked down, and I saw something that made my breath catch. Footprints, fresh footprints, leading from the door into the room. They were small, like someone had been walking around the cabin in the snow. But there was no snow inside the cabin. No mud, no dirt, just footprints, as if someone had been inside the room and the snow had followed them. I followed the footprints with my eyes. They led to the wall that had hidden the room, the wall that had hidden the basement, the wall that had hidden the secret. And there in the corner, I saw something I didn't want to see. A small crack, a thin line in the wall, like a seam, like a door that had been sealed shut. I walked closer. My heart was pounding. I put my hand on the wall. It was cold, but not like the rest of the cabin. This part of the wall felt different. It felt alive, like it was breathing, like it was waiting. I pressed harder. The wall gave slightly. A small gap opened, a narrow slit, and I felt a draft, a cold breath, a breath that smelled like old paper and metal. I stepped back. I felt the urge to leave, to run, to break the door, to do anything to get out. But the cabin didn't want me to leave. The cabin wanted me to stay. The cabin wanted me to become part of it. I looked at the diary again. I felt the pull of the words, the pull of the story, and I realized something that made my throat tighten. The diary wasn't just telling me about Harrison. It was telling me about me. It was describing my thoughts, my fears, my actions. It was predicting what I would do next. It was making me feel like I was already inside the pages, like I was already trapped in the words. I sat back down on the bed. I held the diary close. I stared at the last page. I read the last line again. And then I saw it. The line that I hadn't noticed before. A line that wasn't written in the diary. A line that was carved into the wood of the nightstand. Small letters, hidden in the grain, like a message left by someone who wanted to be found. It said, "She is still here." My breath caught. My hands went cold. I looked around the room. The air felt heavy, like someone was standing in the corner, like someone was waiting. And I realized then what the diary had been trying to tell me. The victim wasn't gone. The victim wasn't dead. The victim was still here, still waiting, still patient, still alive in the walls, in the wires, in the signal, in the story. And the cabin had brought me here for a reason. Not to solve the case, not to find the truth, but to become the next chapter, to become the next voice, to become the next person trapped inside the story. I looked at the crack in the wall. I felt the presence behind it. I felt the silence that was not empty, the silence that was full of someone waiting, full of someone listening, full of someone who had been waiting for a long time. And I understood then that the cabin wasn't just a place where people disappeared. It was a place where stories were kept alive, where voices were stored, where the past was trapped, and where the future was already written. I closed my eyes. I tried to breathe, but the cabin felt like it was closing in, like the walls were moving closer, like the story was tightening around me. And I knew, with a certainty that made my blood run cold, that I was no longer the journalist. I was no longer the observer. I was the story, and the cabin was still listening, still waiting, still patient, still alive.